My aunt told me this story. We are related by marriage, so she has a whole new set of skinwalker stories that I would like to share with you. This story took place when she was a child. My aunt's family lived in a community about 20 miles south of Gallup, New Mexico. The area is far different from where I live. My house is surrounded by desert, and you don't really see trees until you move into the canyon. Bread Springs is a forested area, and where our story takes place. Like many people on the reservation, my aunt's family didn't have running water or electricity, so in order to have water, they would have to drive into town and haul water back in large containers. The containers are huge and easily fit in the bed of the truck. Her family would place 2 containers on a long flatbed trailer to make the best of each trip. Her family went into Gallup, filled up the containers, and went into town to do other types of business. Back then, seatbelt laws weren't so strict, and so my aunt and her siblings sat in the bed of the trucks as they went around town. It began to get dark, and so the family started to go back home. Most roads weren't paved, so they had to drive carefully because of the attached trailer. The lights of the town faded away in the distance, and soon the vehicle was surrounded in darkness. They drove, and the kids sat in the back and talked amongst themselves. That was until my aunt noticed something. A figure was crouched by the farthest water container on the flatbed. The truck wasn't barreling down the road, but it was going at a speed that it would be impossible for someone to run and jump on. My aunt nudged her siblings, and they all paused to look at the dark figure. They sat silently and squinted their eyes to look. It was too dark to really make anything out, and so they ignored her and continued to talk. My aunt kept her eye on the figure and pulled hard on the sleeve of her brother when the figure began to crawl over to one of the water containers. The kids all stopped and watched in horror as the figure began to move carefully over the second container. My aunt said the figure looked like a person, however the limbs were abnormally long. These long limbs pulled its body closer to the kids. At this point, they began to scream and cry. They banged on the window of the truck. At this time, the creature was reaching for the tailgate of the truck. Due to the huge commotion that was now going on in the bed of the truck, the driver slammed on the brakes. The creature hit the tailgate and fell down between the truck and the trailer. The driver rolled down the window and asked what was going on. The kids screamed at the driver to go. They weren't sure they were safe until they saw the trailer move up and down as if it ran over something large. When my aunt told me this story, I sat in disbelief. She told me that she was uncomfortable when this thing was crawling on the trailer, but true fear rang through her body when she saw its eyes. I asked her what she meant. She said they were like teddy bear eyes. I didn't quite understand what that meant until I pressed further. She said the eyes were shiny. When you shine the light in the eyes of an animal, they reflect back. The brake lights were shining, and whatever they saw that night had eyes that glowed back. My grandma was a practitioner of native medicine and ceremonies. She was what the Navajo people call a crystal gazer. People would often come and visit her and ask her for healing or causes of their ailments. At times, people would ask her to help with protection from being attacked by evil entities. My grandma used to teach my aunt and her granddaughter the rituals and ceremonies, much like an apprenticeship. My cousin was one such person my grandma had chosen to teach her shamanistic rituals. She would tell me the weirdest and scariest stories ever. One of the stories she told me was about a pesky skinwalker that attacked a neighbor of my grandparents. The skinwalker would go over to their homestead and tap on the windows, open the horse corral, knock over water barrels, and just be a pest to the family. It was thought that the skinwalker had been sent because of a jealous man was infatuated with the girl that lived there, and she had refused to date a certain person. That family had visited my grandparents and had asked for help, but my grandma was reluctant. A few days later, the skinwalker came back, and this time it harassed the sheep herder. Its attack was relentless, and the sheep herder was frightened and ran over to the family's house in the middle of the night. The father of the house told the sheep herder to calm down and go back to his house. The sheep herder kept saying it was calling his name, and he wanted it to stop. The father walked the sheep herder back to his house and walked around and didn't see anything unusual. The next morning, the sheep herder didn't come over for breakfast, and the father went over to check on the sheep herder. He didn't find him there, and the front door was wide open. The father started to look for the sheep herder. It wasn't long until he found him. The sheep herder was found strangulated by a barbed wire fence that was used at the sheep corral. The sheep were also gone, more than likely from the barbed wire that was taken off of the fence. The family was distraught and visiting my grandma for help. My cousin told me about the ceremony they performed and got rid of the skinwalker. She said the next morning they gathered some ingredients: Navajo ceremonial basket and a crystal arrowhead. She said that in the early morning, before the sunrise, they started the ceremony. She held the basket, and the arrowhead was buried under the ingredients. And while my grandma was singing, the arrowhead started to rise and levitate above the basket, and flew out. They kept singing until the sun came up, and my cousin asked me where the arrowhead went. My grandma told her that the arrowhead took care of the skinwalker that was terrorizing the family. My cousin told me that the family had been freed from the skinwalker's curse, and they wouldn't have to worry about it again. This is a story my family told me when I was growing up. We live in a rural community on the Navajo reservation. My aunt and her 2 brothers were home alone while my grandparents had left for the evening to attend a chapter house meeting. They were in the house, and like many people from the reservation, they didn't have electricity. It had been dark outside for about an hour, and my aunt and uncles were getting ready for bed. Outside, they heard noises, as if something was moving things around. My oldest uncle went to look out the front window and saw a figure by the truck. This was immensely out of the ordinary, because the closest neighbor was miles away. Whatever it was opened the truck door and began to dig through the personal items that my family had left in the vehicle. My aunt and uncles were frightened by the sight and knew they should take action. They took out a rifle and all steadied themselves to hold it up. They flung open the door and aimed it at the dark figure. The figure turned around and started to walk towards them, totally unfazed. My uncle pulled the trigger, but nothing happened. The figure drew closer and my aunt began to smell something like a rotting corpse. It was so strong it made her gag. My uncle continued to pull the trigger with no luck, and the figure came closer and closer. Off in the distance, headlights were coming up the road. My grandparents were returning. The figure looked towards the lights and started to move away and tucked itself behind a tree near the house. My oldest uncle ran towards the truck. My grandfather got out of the car and my uncle pointed to the tree. The thing was poking its head out to observe what they were doing. My grandfather ran into the house over the stove and grabbed a handful of ashes and rubbed it over the gun and bullet and placed it into the chamber. He walked out onto the porch and fired towards the tree. Whatever that thing was didn't expect the gun to go off. The gunshot echoed and the dark figure began running. My grandma chased my aunt inside and my uncles and my grandfather went after it. There weren't many roads or paths, so my grandfather and uncles chased after the figure. The truck was bouncing and the headlights were not fixed on one particular spot. My uncle swears that every time the headlights would hit the figure, he saw a woman. Not only that, it was running on all fours like a bear. My grandfather eventually stopped the truck as it neared the ditch that drops about 20 feet. He got out and began to yell in Navajo. My uncle says that he was yelling about a local woman. He yelled that he wasn't scared and that he knew her, and to leave his family alone. A few days passed and there was news that a woman that my grandfather was yelling about had passed. I've always been told that if you know who a skinwalker is, say their name, and it will kill them. My cousin lived in the eastern agency of the Navajo Nation in a community known as Crown Point. She was still living with her parents at this time and was a good girl, and was very popular and played on the basketball team. When she told us this story, it was very out of the ordinary, and the events that followed would also deepen my beliefs in the traditional Navajo way and of the taboos associated with the Navajo culture. My cousin was coming home from basketball practice, which ran past sunset. It was during the colder months, so it was dark by the time she pulled into her neighborhood. She pulled into a small housing community that she lived in. It was far from a fenced community, but there were streetlights and the neighbors weren't too far from each other. As she neared her home, she saw a group of dogs. This wasn't unlikely, as there are random packs of stray dogs that roam rural communities. These dogs don't belong to anyone, and they get food wherever they can find it. As she got closer, she noticed something was off about the dogs. There were 4 dogs, and they were sitting in a circle, all facing each other. This didn't really faze her until she spoke about the event later. Because this was a housing community, my cousin couldn't barrel down the road, so she slowly drove past the group of dogs and kept going on her own way. As she continued to drive, she noticed in her peripheral vision that something was running alongside her car. She turned her head to see that brown dog from the group was trotting alongside her car. She didn't mind much until she hit a strategically placed speed bump. The impact of the bump made her entire car wobble. She looked over at the dog again, still casually keeping pace with the car. She tried to ignore the dog and tried speeding up, keeping in mind where the speed bumps were placed. The dog continued to keep pace. My cousin had to eventually stop at a stop sign. She began to feel immensely uncomfortable and tried to keep her eyes forward, but curiosity got the best of her. She looked over at the dog. It was facing forward. She continued to stare, and that's when the dog turned its head. Instead of the face of a dog, there was a flat face of a man covered in hair, smiling from ear to ear. Fear shot through her body, and my cousin pushed the pedal to the floor, not daring to look back in her rearview mirror. She reached her house and barely pulled herself in the door, weak from fear. My aunt came to her, and my cousin began to sob. She told my aunt everything, and they scheduled a meeting with a medicine man the next day. That night, my cousin was trying to get some rest. She was tossing and turning and felt very ill. She could hear people outside laughing and talking in Navajo, but she didn't think too much of it because she lived in a community near plenty of neighbors. At the medicine man, she told my cousin that she was very fortunate. The skinwalker wasn't meant for her. She just happened to spot it while it was out bringing another person misfortune. He also told her that the laughing and talking that she heard in the night was the skinwalker talking to its friends, letting them know that someone had saw him and that he had scared her. The medicine man told my cousin if the skinwalker had been for her, and she had seen him like that, it very well could have killed her. After that encounter, my cousin suffered from many ailments, and had to stop playing basketball for a while. She had many ceremonies and eventually got back on her feet. My mom told us this story on many of the nights when the electricity would go out. When I asked my cousin about it, she confirms it's true, but doesn't like talking about it much. Out on the Navajo reservation, we don't have the city come and collect our trash, so we burn our trash in these huge burning barrels. Not very eco-friendly, I know, but it's what we got. If you don't like the trash properly, the fire will go out and the trash will just sit in the barrel. It is important because we are told to dispose of our personal hygiene items correctly. If you removed all of your hair from your brush, make sure the trash burned. If it was that time of month, make sure the trash burned. If you changed a baby's diaper, make sure the trash burned. They tell us these things because skinwalkers have been known to dig through the trash in order to find things that they can get to use against us. They use the things that we're briefly connected to and bring misfortune on to us using these things. Some of my family members take part in the sport of rodeo, so to practice, they have to rope a dummy and take turns roping it. My two male cousins were enjoying themselves outside and taking turns swinging the rope at the fake calf. The elders were always adamant that we shouldn't stay out past sundown, especially out on the res, where it's pitch black and there's no one around for miles. But my cousins weren't the superstitious type, and they were under a streetlight. My cousins were joking around laughing, having a great time. That changes when my eldest cousin looks over to the burn barrel. A dark figure is bent over, rummaging through the garbage that failed to burn. My cousin devised a plan that they were going to grab weapons, sticks, and rocks, and go chase whatever it was. They move strategically, so that they are able to flank the figure. They run full speed and begin yelling and swinging their sticks and throwing their rocks. My cousin said that they kept up with it for the most part. That was until the figure ran underneath the streetlight. What my cousins thought was a person was actually a goat. Why would they think it was a person? Because the goat was running on its hind legs. They stopped running and fear ran down their backs, and the figure ran off into the dark. Feeling nervous and not entirely accepting what they just saw, they began roping the dummy again. There was an awkward silence amongst the boys now. They saw something so unnatural, but talking about it now would just make it seem real. Were they crazy? Did they really see a skinwalker? The boys roped the dummy in silence until one of them looked over to the tree. There was a head peeking out at them. If they didn't pay attention to it, whatever it was would just poke its head out from behind the tree and stare. When they would look in the direction of the tree, it would quickly move back out of sight. This was the final straw, and my cousins ran back into the house. They told their parents and my uncle came out to look. It was still there, poking its head out and going behind the tree. My uncle loaded his gun and started to walk towards the tree. He aimed and pulled the trigger, but nothing happened. The gun jammed. Whatever it was began to run, but it was so fast, like a blur, as my cousin describes it. When it left, my uncle gave the boys a thorough lecture about staying out late. The next day, my cousins told my uncle about whatever it was had been digging through the trash barrel. They went out to investigate and saw the creature had pulled out a lot of things out of the barrel. What was odd was the tracks. Goat prints were all around the area. They followed a set of tracks that were found around a baby diaper, several feet away from the barrel. Whatever they saw that night had very malevolent intentions. My cousins said that although the sight was ungodly, they know what they saw and stand by their claims. So I grew up in Utah and lived about an hour away from the Skinwalker Ranch. And going there as a high schooler was just a thing to do, just to see if it was true or not, and to see if you actually got scared. But here's my story. First time me and a couple friends went out there, we got pretty far in. We got out of the car and started walking around. Mind you, this was around 1:30 in the morning. We found an old beat-up wood shed that looked like it was falling apart, but you could see through the holes of it. There were hooks, the kind you use for hanging up deer or cows. They looked mostly rusted, but the walls and everything around looked like it was splattered with old dried blood. It was everywhere, but of course it was dried. But the worst part started happening when we walked away from the shed. Since we had a couple of flashlights, we looked around when we were walking. We would see pairs of eyes around us. At first, it was just the shiny reflective look, like when you shine the light at a dog or a cat. So we thought it was just a couple dogs or coyotes. We continued on a bit more until we started seeing more eyes. But they were red, like bright red, even if you had the light in their direction, and they were a lot higher than a normal level would be for an animal. That's when we decided to turn back. What started to get me was one pair was always in front of us as we were walking to the car, staring at us like it was walking backwards with us. We never caught up to it, but it never left. Same with all of the others that kept circling us as we made our way back to the car. When we got to the car, we just wanted to get out of there. We got in and it wouldn't start. Nothing would turn on at first, no matter how hard he turned the key. He tried it twice, then only the radio kicked on. We started panicking because the eyes got closer. Then bam! Something hit the side of the car really hard, but we couldn't see what it was. It hit the car on the right side 3 times. My buddy got the car started finally after like 5 minutes of freaking out, trying to get it going. I'm in the passenger seat about to crap myself, and my other friend was in the back seat, freaked out but speechless, with the most scared look I've ever seen. But when he got the car started, there was no delay in leaving. He put the car in gear and spun those tires and got us out of there. Once you get out of the gate onto the main road that goes by, you're pretty much off the ranch. We thought we were away from everything since we were on an actual road, but my buddy didn't slow down. We were going 85 miles an hour down that road, going right home. I looked, and to the left, about 15 feet off, was a pair of red eyes. It was keeping up to us, and that's when it charged at us. I kind of got a glimpse before it smashed into the side of the car. It was definitely big, like 4 feet from its legs to its headish looking thing. Kind of hard to explain when I didn't get a great look at it. We eventually lost it, and when we got home, we went straight to bed. But in the morning, we looked at his car. One huge dent on the left rear fender and another dent on the right door on the passenger side, about the size of my head. We were so lucky to get out of there. So every summer I go to a lake in upstate New York, near the Canadian border. My family has a house that is pretty much in the middle of nowhere. It's a 30 to 45 minute drive to the nearest convenience store. We have 3 neighbors on our side of the lake, but there aren't any kids and it's mostly all retired or vacationing elderly people. They don't stay up past 10 and it's perfectly quiet when the sun goes down. Here's my story. I have zero explanation for this, and the most reasonable thing to assume is a skinwalker. Around 11:30 p.m., maybe midnight, my cousin and I go down to the dock on the water. We have to walk through a short path in the woods to get there, and the thick trees border directly on the shore. While looking out at the stars and the water, we hear a quiet, raspy rumbling. That's the best way I can explain it. Out of the forest, pretty far away. We didn't really know what it was and wasn't bothered by it. About 2 minutes later, we hear the same voice say both of our names. This time it was closer to our property, From our dock, we can see along the shoreline, and we're near a corner so we could see pretty well along the coast to our left. We were looking with a flashlight in the trees and saw nothing. Maybe someone was out kayaking at night and said something to their friend, and we just heard them wrong. Sounds travel across water very easily, so it couldn't have been someone from their house, although our neighbors are about 1/3 of a mile away. Our uncle couldn't have been pulling a prank on us because of how far away it was, and there wasn't any light. 5 minutes pass and we've calmed down. While we were sitting there in silence, thinking about what just happened, we hear footsteps. Loud, leaf-crunching footsteps about 10 feet to the left of our dock, right behind the tree line, so we couldn't see anything. These footsteps were either from a human, bear, or deer. My cousin whispered to me that we need to get inside, but I told him that it might be a bear, and I didn't want to get chased while running back inside. So we were sitting on the dock holding our breath as the footsteps continued, then stopped for a bit. All of a sudden we hear the same voice that said our names. Hello. I have never been more scared in my life. The voice was speaking English, but it wasn't human. It had an almost robotic growl under the word. Both of us flipped out at this point and sprinted inside, not even trying to glance at what was in the trees. My uncle was sitting on the couch with our dog. We spent the next 30 minutes checking the whole property in the nearby forest and didn't see anything. What the hell could it have been? This happened a little more than a week ago, and the scariest part I wondered was, how did that thing know our names? And why was it on our property? Yesterday I was reminded of the Skinwalker from some videos on YouTube. It fits perfectly with the story, but they aren't known for being in New York. I wish I saw what it was, to see if it had a human or a deer form, but the trees were so thick and it was so dark we couldn't see anything behind the trees. Anyways, talking about them is apparently bad luck, and encountering what I experienced ever again will be too soon. So this took place in my dad's, then girlfriend's house, during broad daylight in Grand Rapids, Minnesota, just off of River Road. Behind the house there was a forest, but it's a bit dense to play in, so we'd usually just follow the deer trail a bit into the woods, till there was a clearing where there was a barbed wire fence that cut right through the middle of it. We'd hop the fence and go through the woods on the other side. On the other side was a planted pine forest that ran along the fence for the airport there. It was pretty wide open back there, so you could see straight down the rows to the other side. My brother and I were back there with the girlfriend's nephew, just tromping around. You know, just some kids being rowdy and noisy. Well, at the very end of the rows of trees is a road, which is actually a fire trail, but we called it the road. And on the other side of the road was a more dense forest. We reached the road and stopped and talked like we usually did, to look at a deer track or a squirrel or something, when this skunky bear-like smell came up. My brother and I both felt an urge to look up the road towards the airport fence. What I saw was what looked like the head of a huge black wolf, but it didn't look right. His ears weren't in the right spots and looked droopy, and his eyes looked off. They were too big and bright for his face. His front legs were long and skinny, but he was standing right like a wolf, just way too big. My brother and I looked at each other, and here's where I'm going to mention that my brother and I are very close, so we would usually give each other a look and know what it meant. Here we looked at each other and instantly started to briskly walk back. The girlfriend's nephew just started to walk with us. He asked what was up and we just shushed him. We were being as quiet as we could, but we knew it would hear every step and movement of us. Once we hopped the barbed wire fence, we ran as fast as we could to get to the house. Once we got to the back entrance, we looked back, and there it was, looking at us through the brush. We didn't hear it move behind us or anything. We pointed it out to the nephew, and we all watched it flop back into the woods. Now my brother and I have been raised on 80 acres of land just south of Bobbing. We've seen wolf, bear, moose, mountain lions, coyote, pretty much everything else. We both have never seen a wolf that big and lanky in our lives. I feel like it's important to note that at least I didn't feel any dread or anything like that. It was more a primal fear, like I knew we all had to get away from it, but not show we were afraid. I felt like if we ran from it, it would have taken us down. My brother and I told my dad, and he didn't seem too interested, but he was that way about everything growing up. The next morning, my brother and I went back out to look for tracks, so we could see where and how it stalked us. We saw huge dog-like tracks. and about 6 feet up in a tree, following its route back, we found thick black fur. We noped out of there fast and didn't go back without protection. About a few weeks later, I'm home alone. All the doors are locked, and only the back windows on the house are open. I suddenly notice the dogs are acting weird. Then I hear clear as day, by the back door, my dad's girlfriend's voice call for her dog. I froze but looked up at my bedroom doorway into the small hall. The dog got up and went to the kitchen where the back door was. She was quiet for a moment, then I heard her claws skid across the floor and she ran back to my room. I closed the door and locked it fast and closed my window. The only reason it freaked me out was because I didn't hear the garage door open, or the side door open, just the voice. I blessed my room and made sure nothing was allowed in it or around it. The next time my brother visited, he slept in the living room. Now the living room was huge, and you could see out to the front deck. As my brother was sleeping, he heard what he described as an old woman screaming on the deck. He woke up panicking and said he turned on the porch light, and there was a big black crow sitting on the deck banister. After that, he only slept in my room, never out in the open. I'd also like to note that neither of us knew what a skinwalker was at the time, being that we were 11 and 13 years old, and lived in the north. We just assumed that it was a goofy wolf that smelled bad. For context, I live in the Midwest in a suburban area. My boyfriend lives about 30 to 60 minutes away from me, depending on if I use either the interstate, highway, or the city roads. That being said, I usually take the interstate, then take the highway partway home, since the highway is only about a mile or so away from his neighborhood, and I take it all the way to the interstate. There is also another road I can take, a paved country road with one lane on each side of the road, with no streetlights. It eventually meets up with a few main streets, which are numbered roads, and it will take you back towards the highway and city. I'm sorry for all the background about the roads, but I feel it's important. And I feel like my choice was a definite sign that the butterfly effect is always in works. On to the story. Earlier today, I went to pick up my boyfriend and we basically hung out and binge-watched a TV show I recently got him in. Around 11 p.m., he says he probably should go home since he works in the morning. I agree and drive him home using the interstate with no problems. We kiss goodbye, and then I am on my way out of the neighborhood and towards the street that takes me to the main roads. If I turn right, it's a straight shot to the highway. If I turn left, I could take it down to the country road for a bit of a late night drive. I decide to take the latter. I turn left, then turn right at the stoplight and begin to drive through the dark country night. So I had my windows rolled down and my music up, just letting the breeze come in. It was pretty windy, so my car was swerving a little, and you couldn't see the stars or anything because the clouds were taking over the sky, building up a storm. I thought about switching on my high beams to see better, but the road was really curvy and had lots of hills, and I was afraid of accidentally blinding someone coming from the opposite direction. What happened next makes me glad I didn't turn them on. On the left side there was a small patch of woods with overgrowth. To my right were wide open fields, and in front of me was a hill. Toward the crest of the hill, I saw something beginning to cross the road, something large and dark, with what looked like antlers on its head. I thought maybe at first it was a deer, or even an elk, and I slowed down. But when I got closer, I realized something was wrong. One of the things that were wrong was it was moving very slow, like it was hurt or something, and it didn't even glance at me. It just kept moving toward the patch of trees on my left, which I thought seemed weird. I felt like it should have at least acknowledged the sound of my vehicle. The second thing was, this animal that I presumed was a deer or an elk, couldn't have been. It was at least the size of a moose, but that couldn't be right, because where I am from, there are no moose. We had deer and maybe some elk, but no moose. I felt a cold wave of dread wash over me as I watched this moose thing make its way across the road, and then it stopped, and it looked right at me. It twisted its head so fast to look at me I almost screamed. Its face was hideous. It looked rotten somehow, like it was withering away, and its eyes were so dark. I was so scared it didn't have any eyes. There was something dripping from where the mouth was, and I could see sharp teeth poking from its lips as they pulled back into a sneer. I thought about reversing my car and hightailing it out of there, but I was frozen. You know how when adrenaline kicks, they say you either enter fight or flight mode? Well, they don't tell you that there's a third option, and that's to freeze, which is exactly what I did. I just stayed in place, my hands still on the wheel, foot still digging into the brakes. I don't know how long I sat there staring at this thing, with the thing staring back at me, but when it started towards my car, I honestly thought that was going to be the end of me. I couldn't move, couldn't blink, could barely even breathe. All I could do was hope and pray that I wouldn't be ended by some freakish moose-looking monster. And then a pair of lights began to rise over the hill toward us, and as the other vehicle's high beams shined on the thing in the road, it let out a curdling scream that didn't sound entirely human. It was animalistic and sort of raspy. It's hard to explain. But I watched as that thing got on its hind legs and lurched itself across the road into the thicket of the trees and bushes, narrowly missing the other person. I knew this thing would probably come back if I stayed where I was, so before I could give it the chance, I slammed on my gas pedal and gunned it out of there, going well over the posted speed limit. I just wanted to get as far away from it as possible. Every dark curve or patch of trees or field made me feel so paranoid that I could see the creature again, and all I wanted to do was go home and never, for the life of me, drive on that country road again. I made it home safe, but was shaken, and to cut a long story short, my family thought I was just being hysterical and had just seen a deer, but I know what I saw, and this thing wasn't a deer. It couldn't have been. I've read up on skinwalkers, but I'm not sure if it's what I saw. I mean, do they even exist out in the Midwest? I thought that was more in Arizona or New Mexico. Why would a skinwalker be here? Why would it come after me? Was it even a skinwalker, or was it something else entirely? Was it my mind playing tricks on me? What was that thing? Please, if anyone knows what it was, or has any idea of it, please tell me. I'm so scared I'm going to come across that thing again, and I don't know if next time I'll be as lucky. This is 100% true, so this will probably be a boring account compared to some of the other posts here, but I wanted to share this memory somewhere, and maybe get opinions on the matter. I grew up in Albuquerque, New Mexico. My mom would often take us camping in the summers. This particular camping trip was somewhere in the vicinity of Shiprock, New Mexico. My mother took my older brother Chris, 10, and myself, 8, camping often in those days, and preferred dispersed camping on BLM/NPS land to camping in merged grounds. She'd usually find us a spot and make herself busy setting up the tents and pit, while Chris and I would scamper around and explore the area and be generally unhelpful. On this particular trip, we arrived in the middle of the day, and as my mom started setting up camp, Chris and I started to explore the area around our campsite. We wandered into the woods of our campsite. Being in the desert, it was really just stunted trees and sagebrush, so I hesitate to describe it as a forest, but the trees and brush were taller than me and provided a decent screen. I wandered down into a gully and came face to face with what I described to my mother as a wolf kangaroo. It was crouched low, with long, slender arms reaching down to the ground, and large, pointed ears like a deer. The fur covering its body was sandy brown and patchy, as if it had mange. It had large, orange eyes and a snout like a wolf or a coyote. It bared its teeth at me and stood up. At its full height, it was the biggest animal I had ever seen, towering over us and the sagebrush. I had never been, and probably still have never been, as frightened as I was then. Chris and I started screaming for our mom to come to our rescue. Chris regained his senses before me, taking off running back up the embankment to the campsite. The wolf kangaroo turned and sort of, speed skated away from us through the brush and tree. Its legs were backwards, like a dog's, and its strides took it far away and fast, faster than any deer or antelope I'd ever seen. After a split second of staring at it in horror, I followed my brother up the embankment, screaming for my mom. We were so frightened that my mom packed us back into the car and moved camps, conceding for once to stay in the managed campground. Chris and I were too scared to sleep in our tent that night, and we clung to Mom at the smallest twig snapping in the brush. So that's my story. It's boring compared to some of the others here, but it's 100% true, and I wanted to share. I vividly remember the way this animal moved as it glided away from us into the desert, and the sheer, utter horror I felt looking into its face. Chris and I have never managed to find an explanation for what we saw that day in the brush. I used to work at a local coal mining company on the Navajo Reservation as an operator for a coal haulage crew. I drove haulage equipment, and it was one of those Crest 240-ton coal haul belly dump trucks. If you've ever seen those trucks, they're pretty huge. They're about 2 to 3 stories high and about 1/3 the length of a football field. I remember that I was working the night shift, which started around 11 p.m. Before we started the shift, we were required to do a pre-start inspection of our equipment. I walked around my truck, and when I went up to the rear of the truck and lowered its stairs, that gave me access to the engine bay. I walked up the stairs and started my inspection. I found a pretty bad coolant leak on the truck. I climbed back down and went to the cab and called my haulage supervisor. He answered and asked me if I can drive the truck to the main shop for repairs. So I left the ready line and drove 6 to 8 miles back to the shop, and I called the shop maintenance supervisor, and he instructed me to drive around back of the shop and park the truck there. I drove around the shop, parked the truck, and I wanted to see how much coolant I had left. I climbed back down from the cab, walked around to the back side of the truck, and lowered the stairs. I checked the coolant level, and I had a significant loss of coolant. I called my supervisor over the radio and asked him to pick me up. As I started to walk away from the truck towards the shop, I seen it. It was big, like a bull. It walked weird. Patches of tan fur missing, blotches of blackened skin, and its head was big. The head was as large as a pumpkin, and it wobbled around like it was unbalanced. It had an unnatural look, nothing like I'd ever seen. This thing walked on all fours and about 4 to 5 feet tall. It was about 100 feet away and was walking toward me. My first instinct was that it was a sick dog, mange-infested and malnourished. It continued to walk toward me, and I thought this sucker might be sick and have rabies. I took out my flashlight and shined the light at it, yelling at it to stay away. It continued to walk towards me. It was then that I noticed it wasn't alive. Its eyes did not give off any reflection and were black and solid. It was unnatural. I reached for my pocket knife and yelled at it to stop. It stopped when it was about 20 feet away. I was still walking towards the shop, and it paralleled me all the way there. I never looked away. I thought it could attack me. By the time I got to the shop door entrance, it started walking towards the east. I went inside and got the shop supervisor, and we both came out. It wasn't about a minute later, and it was gone. We walked to the east, and my supervisor drove up. Now, there was only one way into the back side of the shop, and my supervisor should have seen it. He didn't. I explained to him what I saw, and he said he didn't see it on the way into the shop. My supervisor said that I saw a skinwalker, and that it usually was seen walking around the shop. The rest of the shift, I stayed with my supervisor. I think he was scared. I wasn't scared, nor did I go into shock like some people describe. It was an experience that I would never forget. To this day, I don't know what I witnessed those few days, nor do I want to know. I think it would be better that way. To set the scene with some background information, I'm a 20-year-old Latino woman. I'm a Lance Corporal in the Marine Corps, and have spent a year in Afghanistan back in 2015. During the time of this experience, my girlfriend and I took a camping trip, and for the sake of this story, I will call her Olivia. I've grown up in a very wooded area of Florida. Many trees and animals of all sorts. Alligators, bears, panthers, coyotes, and sometimes wolves from people owning them and letting them into the wild when they got big. The area we had gone to was new terrain for us. She insisted we go somewhere new and explore around, since I would have to return to California to my duty station in a few days. She wanted to explore the new terrain with me. We walk along the beaten path, admiring nature in the wooded areas, flowers, and even small animals and birds that inhabited the area. Olivia went to college for zoology, so she enjoyed teaching me about the different animals and the ways to identify them by their tracks and other signs. As we were walking to the camp clearing in this particular forest, we came across a hardly visible pathway, winding deeper into the brush. Her nature calling was pulling her into it. She wanted to explore and find a place inside to set up camp. But call it military intuition, but I felt really uneasy with the idea. Reluctantly, with her pleading, I agreed. We then began to trek through the brush, thorny vines cutting up my legs through my jeans, and a spider web hitting me in the face every now and again, due to the overlaying branches. We walked for roughly 45 minutes until we came into a clearing, deciding this was the best spot we could set up camp. Olivia pitched our tents as I got the fire roaring, and at this point, the dusk is creeping in on us. We lay down to settle in for the night, and all is well. That is, until I'm awakened by things being thrown by the side of my tent. It takes me a little bit for my eyes to adjust to the darkness. The campfire was now a dim glow. My eyes finally adjust as I look around. I wasn't truly awake until the smell hit me like a semi-truck. The smell of rotting garbage. It was sickening. As I tried to gain my composure, that's when I saw the figure. It was tall, very large and stocky, and appeared very human-like. Just too large to be a person. There was still tapping against the tent, some large, others small, but I didn't make a peep. My voice was lodged in my throat, and I'm not even sure at this point I was breathing. All the hair on my body was on end. I was terrified. Olivia shifted in her sleep, opening her eyes. "Hey, is everything okay?" I cut her off by placing my hand over her mouth, raising a finger to my lips in order to tell her to be quiet. That's when I heard it. The growling. It was low, more like a grumble and a groan than a growl, but it was a sound like no other. It was enough to make even my drill sergeants piss themselves. Our eyes directed to the zipper, and it began to move. It slowly started unzipping. Whatever this thing was, it was getting into our tent. I reached next to me and grabbed a small handgun I took everywhere with me, and took aim. A rather loud bang is heard as I took my shot, making a direct hit into the thing's shoulder. A monstrous growl scream is heard. It rattled me to the bone, and Olivia only cried out of pure fear. We watched as this figure disappeared, and we didn't fall asleep just in case it returned. I stayed with her all night, my handgun at my side. The next morning, we were packing all of our stuff and getting ready to head out when we saw it. A stocky figure standing in the tree line. It was around 8, maybe 9 feet tall. It was large, hairy, and seemed rather human-like, besides its dark, deep eyes and fur-covered body. It just watched us as we collected our things. We never broke eye contact either. The thing just watched before sinking back into the woods. We've never ran so fast in our lives back to the main road. Olivia still has nightmares about this thing that terrorized us by throwing things and opening our tent. And I'll admit, the thing really creeped me out. Let me just tell you, I haven't been camping since. During the summer of 2016, my larger group of friends and I went camping out at this spot called Desert Creek. It's a place that's about 100 miles from any town, deep in some mountains in Nevada. I'm not of any sort of native descent, but I've heard a few skinwalker stories before. I didn't believe them too much until this night. My large group drove out to the camp spot and got set up. Being stupid teenagers, we started drinking. It was 4th of July weekend, so the camp spots were sort of busy, but all of the spots were pretty far apart, so we didn't think we would have too many problems. The drinking started around 2 in the afternoon, right after we set up camp. While setting up my tent, I noticed some odd footprints, but didn't think too much of it. By the time night fell, all of us were pretty drunk. I decided I had to go take a leak, so I walked over to a tree. But before I could, I saw what looked like a coyote, but something was off about it. It turned and looked at me and stood up on 2 feet, and it sounded like it was trying to say something to me, but it couldn't get out the words. They were just sounds for a few seconds. I was paralyzed with fear, and then it seemed like the words started to become more clear, but it's still not right. I heard my best friend, let's call him C. C's voice came from its mouth. "Hey, hand me another beer." That's when I snapped out of it. I turned and ran back to camp and told everyone, but no one believed me, and I wasn't sure if I believed myself. But after, I became really paranoid. I thought I could hear sounds all night. When it was time to go to bed, I had almost forgotten about it. Keep in mind, we were about 2 36 packs, in between about 8 of us. I was lying in my tent listening to the crackling of the fire when all of a sudden I could hear footsteps, but they were scattered. I looked out the window of the tent and saw a humanoid figure about 10 feet away standing next to the fire staring at me. Then it said again in C's voice, "Hey guys, I think I'm gonna go to bed." That's when I heard C say from his tent, "What was that?" He poked his head out of the tent and screamed. Everybody got up at that point, and that's when this thing turned and lunged at my other friend. Let's call him Jay. Jay jumped out of the way and hopped into his car, which was right next to his tent. The thing then howled this terrifying sound, and that's when I realized the smell of rotten eggs and burning garbage. The thing ran away and C said, "Guys, we need to get out of here." We all hopped into our cars and started driving out. when one of my friends in front of me stopped about a mile from the main road. I got out with the pistol my dad had let me borrow for protection, and I realized my friend's truck had a flat tire. We all heard the howl again, and it sounded like it was in the middle of the canyon where we were in, about a 25-minute drive away from us. We thought we would be okay, so we got to work putting the spare tire on. We had only just gotten the flat tire off and we started to smell the rancid odor again. We stopped and looked around and heard the howl once again, this time right next to us. We bolted to our cars and tried to drive away when this thing jumped out in front of the car and stood up. The creature looked into my eyes and spoke once more, but in a demonic-like voice. Gonna have to try harder than that. I slammed on the gas and this thing jumped over my car. We got out of there and drove 150 miles back home, still drunk and way past curfew, but we didn't care. The next morning, I drove my friend back to his truck, and when we both got there, we were both struck with this terrible feeling in our stomachs. His truck's windows were broken, and scratched into the car all over the place was every single one of our full names. There were 2 animals in the bed of the truck, but we couldn't tell what kind of animals they were because they were so mangled. From that point on, we had never given a thought to going camping at Desert Creek ever again. I will not say my name for this story, as I am afraid they will find me, but you can call me Rose. I was 14 when it happened, so about a year ago. I was at a powwow with my friends, a young girl, let's call her Lily, and her older sister, Saria. It was getting late, probably around 10 p.m., when we came up with the idea to tell scary stories. I've always been fascinated by skinwalker stories, though I have never seen one myself. Well, that was about to change. I came up with a story and told my friends, then Lily, then Saria. After telling stories, we finally got tired and went to bed. Saria and Lily slept in a small tent, while I slept in a camper with my dad. I've been up where the powwow is many times, and we call the area the grounds. I'm not really a native. I have a little Blackfoot, but I'm mostly Irish. The grounds are full of mostly Cherokee. Anyway, I came up with a stupid idea to scare my friends. I went outside next to their tent and snapped a twig. Then I made loud footsteps along with hard breathing and groaning noises. I could see their shadows sit up, so I knew they were awake. I was just about to shake the tent when I heard footsteps behind me. I knew there were bears and big cats in the woods, but they rarely come in the grounds because all of the lights and people. I didn't want to take any chances, so I slowly walked towards my camper. Then I hear the same groaning noises I made behind me. I thought it was Lily or Saria trying to get me back, but something wasn't right. It sounded just like my voice. Haha, very funny guys. I call back to their tent. Haha, very funny guys, said someone who sounded just like me in the woods. Then I see Lily and Saria walk out of their tent. Will you stop? We're trying to sleep, said Saria in an annoyed voice. A branch breaks and echoes in the woods. Saria and Lily look behind them to see nothing. I think a bear is out there. Hurry, come inside my camper, I whisper to them. They both walk towards me, when suddenly a loud, curdling scream filled my ears. It sounded like a girl and a dog screaming in the woods. Loud footsteps came closer to us. We ran as fast as we could to my camper and slammed the door shut. I looked out the window and see a dark shadow next to my friend's tent. Then I did something I still regret to this day. I got a flashlight and shined it at the figure. It had the head of a bear and the upper body of a human and the legs of some kind of dog. It stood on its hind legs and stared at us with glowing eyes. I screamed so loud I probably woke everyone up from a mile away. My dad came running. What's wrong? Are you okay? I yelled, Skinwalker. I saw a skinwalker. My dad got out his shotgun while his friend, who was staying the night, let's call him Jack, grabbed a bowl of sage. My dad ran out the door to see nothing. Jack lit the sage and put it in the bowl outside the front door. We stayed inside the rest of the night. The next morning, we went out to investigate the area where the skinwalker was. All of us almost puked from the rotten smell of animals. I went home the next day. You would think the story ends there, but sadly no. There's more. I was laying in bed trying to sleep when I heard footsteps outside my window. I looked at my window to see a face of a bear. It followed me home. I screamed, but I was home alone because my mom was still at work. The skinwalker banged at my window, cracking it. I tried to let out another scream, but what came out was a loud growl. The creature froze. I did something I thought I would never do. I ran to the window and yelled, "Go away! Be gone!" at the creature. Slowly, it backed away into the woods. I stayed up all night waiting for it to come back, but it never did. Why did it follow me home? And why did I do what I did? I probably will never know, but all I care about is it's never coming back. I'm 15 now, and still no sight of the monster. Hopefully, I will never see something like that again. My name is Jonathan. I'm 22. I've encountered this creature twice, so I'm covering the first time I saw the thing, which was when I was 14 and lived with my parents. My grandparents told me stories of skinwalkers, and they took them quite literally, which is how I knew what this thing was. One night, I was getting ready to go to bed, and my cat was in my window. As I went to get into bed, he started growling. I didn't really think much of it, just thought maybe he saw a deer or a strayed cat or dog. He kept going and started hissing. Then my curiosity got the best of me and I looked out the window. I froze. I hadn't looked directly at it. I had just looked at my yard, and its glowing red eyes caught the corner of my eye. I knew exactly what it was. I tried to move, but I just couldn't, as it just stared at me and my cat, still hissing and growling. A couple of seconds went by and it let out a curdling scream, so loud it might as well have been right in front of me. I broke the gaze and closed the curtains, grabbing my cat and getting away from the window. Then, not a couple seconds later, I heard a tapping at my window. I knew they were really fast, so I wasn't surprised that it got to my window so quickly. My gut had sank at this point, and I couldn't move. My cat was silent but on edge, and all of its hair was standing up. Then it tried to speak. There's no explanation on how it did this, but that it's been around for a very long time. It said, "Jonathan, come here. I need your help." The most frightening part about that was it was in my dad's voice, but he had been gone for over a year now. The tapping continued for about 10 minutes and stopped completely. Longest 10 minutes of my life. After it stopped, I heard footsteps stomp off quickly into the woods where I lived. I didn't get any sleep that night, and the next morning everyone was up and didn't seem like they had heard anything, and acted like everything was normal. I haven't told anyone, and you're the only person I've told this. I couldn't tell if it was a skinwalker or a wendigo, as I didn't see any of its features except that it had glowing red eyes, and that it mimicked my dad. I was 15 when this happened. I have some family in Arizona, so I decided to go out there for the summer. I was very bold and stupid. My grandmother used to say, "You're like a young wolf cub, always trying to figure out your fangs. That can lead to trouble." I didn't understand at the time what she meant by that. My uncle, let's call him Tom, told my cousins and I when I arrived not to go out at night. I thought to myself, why not? Sure, the place is colder at night, but I'm 15, almost a man. So I waited until he, his wife, and children went to sleep that night. I snuck out of the house quietly. I was wandering around, looking at everything, houses, stores, etc. I had walked 2 to 3 miles away from the house when I realized that I needed to take a leak somewhere away from the streetlights. I found a house with no one living in it not too far from the road. I stepped off the street, going around the right side of the house. I was in the middle of doing my business and I thought I heard a cry from a little girl, but it sounded somewhat off, like if it was coming from a tunnel or something far off in the distance. I listened closer for a while before stepping in that direction I thought it may have come from. I yelled, "Hey, little girl, where are you?" Then the crying just stopped. I was confused. What was going on? That's when I heard it. My own voice, but not quite right. More like a growl reply. "I'm scared. Can you come to the other side and help me get home?" The home was almost a dog's growl. My mind was racing now that I was fully creeped out, and I felt an overpowering need to run. As I turned to do just that, I heard movement from somewhere behind me. At the same time, I started smelling something like rotten meat. Looking back, I saw it. I think it was trying to look human, but the way it moved, like a movie zombie, all stiff. Though once it saw me, it started moving much smoother, plus its eyes were wrong. They look like dog eyes when light hits them at night. As it moved closer, the thing tried to mimic my Uncle Tom's voice. I just ran from it, but as messed up as its walk was, the thing was fast. I ran full speed, but the thing was catching up fast. The thing passed me, then turned into the middle of the road. I saw something about it, now that it was in the streetlight. Not only was its eyes dog-like, but the face was no longer human, but looked like a coyote now. My instincts told me to run the other way. I was frozen, and before my eyes, the rest of the body snapped and popped as it was transforming into the coyote on all fours. I ran in the direction of my uncle's house. I heard it coming for me as I ran. This is where something weird happened. As it got close this time, my mind went blank. I don't know how to explain this, but I'll do my best. I saw a gray wolf in my mind's eye, and I turned, realizing a growl from my mouth that even sounded like a wolf's growl. The thing stopped, clocked its head to the side, and just stared at me. The thing looked like a coyote, but it was standing on its hind legs. I started walking backwards, seeing the gray wolf, and knowing I was using my instincts at the moment, that if I turned to run, it would cease to chase me down and get me. I kept my eyes on it until I was almost to my uncle's door, where I regained control of my mind. Going into the house, I heard scratching on the door, asking in different voices to be let in for an hour, then it left. It did come back the next night to my uncle's house, but Tom knew what it was after. Looking at it through the window of the front door, it pretended to be human again, but tried to use my voice to get Tom to open the door. He went straight to work, burning sage and other herbs, afterwards asking me if I was the only one it was after. I told him everything. He was mad, telling me, "You're safe for the night, but I'm sending you home in the morning." I know he was mad, but I needed to know what this was. He told me it was a skinwalker, and it was going to hunt me until it loses my scent. He told me about the legend of them, but the wolf thing, he smiled and said that, "You'll have to figure that one out for yourself." The next day, I was picked up by my mom. I am afraid to go back that way. I don't walk at night anymore, and I still have no answer about the wolf thing that stopped through my mind that night. I was heading to a small town in southern Utah with my wife and a couple of friends. We were on our way to see Lee, a friend of mine that hadn't been seen for a long time. We met up with him at his place and decided to hang out at a nearby lake. It was a typical quiet campsite with a fire pit and a couple of logs around it. We had a little picnic there and we were exchanging stories and catching up with each other all day. Eventually, one of my friends, Bryce, got tired and decided to fall asleep in the car while the rest of us continued talking. At this point, twilight had fallen. Erica and I were discussing something while my wife and Lee were talking about something else. All of a sudden, my wife and Lee fall silent. Erica and I quickly notice. We look at them and Lee says, "Get in the car." I asked him, "What's wrong?" And he says, "There might be a skinwalker around." Now, Erica and I had no idea what a skinwalker was at the time, so we asked him to explain. After his explanation of what it was, Erica and I, being the only sensible thinkers at the moment, and Bryce, just barely waking up from us jumping in the car, decide we should investigate, believing that it was probably just some kids in a nearby campsite trying to mess with us. We came to the top of the hill that was between our campsite, and looked for any likely candidates for the scare. None. All we could see was a couple of trees and some bushes. We even called out and there was no response. As we were walking back to the campsite, we heard it. A rustling in the bushes behind us. We look again but see nothing. At this point, we were considering that Lee and my wife may be right. We get back and it's getting dark fast, so I ask them, "Is there something we can do to keep them away for a little bit?" "Yes," said Lee. "They don't like fire." And Tim, my wife, and Bryce start working on the fire, while me and Erica go down by the lake to collect the 2 liters we had put there in the water to keep cold. Now it's dark, and Erica and I headed back with the sodas. We hear rustling in the bushes beside us. We're both scared. We hurry back and start putting everything back in the car as soon as possible, while Lee made sure the fire kept burning. After getting everything into the car, I rush over to the fire pit and tell everyone to get in the car as I proceeded to stomp the fire out. Right as the fire went out, I hear a curdling scream across the lake. I felt my heart stop. Lee had said skinwalkers are fast and could make up a full lap around the lake in a matter of seconds. I jump in the car and yell, "Go!" Right as the engine started and the lights come on, we see it. Coming out of the bushes right in front of us, glowing yellow eyes and what looked like a zombified coyote with decaying flesh. A skinwalker. We backed up and peeled out of there as fast as we could. This happened 2 years ago, and it still scares me to how close of a call it was. I am honestly amazed that we all survived such a close encounter with this skinwalker. When I was about 11 or 12, we lived in a small house made of mud and stone, a lot like our house now. It was 2 of my brothers and I in the house. Everyone else had gone to the feast and left us to tend the sheep. We were getting ready for bed when we heard the dogs going crazy outside. Thinking it was nothing more than coyotes howling in the distance, we told them to be quiet. We began to drift off into sleep, and the dogs would not shut up. Somehow, I was able to get a few hours of sleep. Then I woke up very late in the night. It was very quiet and still in the house, except for my brother snoring and breathing. I realized I needed to use the outhouse and woke up my brother to take me there. He teased me about being scared, which I certainly was. We went out with our flashlight to the outhouse. The dogs began with their crazed barking out in the sagebrush, going from one place to the next. My brother went first and I waited for him outside. While waiting, I tried to follow the dogs with my flashlight. Suddenly, there was a very loud whine from one of the dogs. Then everything went silent again. It was really too quiet for that time of year. Not even the sheep were making noise. Suddenly, I heard a few of the dogs going completely mad by the truck. When I looked over, there was this man. He was unbelievably tall, leaning one arm on the cab roof of the truck. He was looking at the dogs for a little. They all scattered in different directions. The thing looked up at me, and I saw its face. It had a pure white face, like a full moon, 2 burning yellow eyes, and a slight smile that was pure black. I could not move or make a sound. It began to walk towards me with long strides, until it finally towered over me. All I began to see was dark red. I kept getting deeper and deeper into its eyes. I could faintly hear my brother coming out of the outhouse. With this, the thing looked up at him. Reality came rushing back to me. I noticed my brother was too distracted with his buckle to realize what was going on. I noticed this thing's long hands hovering just inches from my head. Its skin was black ash and smelt like rotten flesh in the summer. I was still unable to move or speak. The skinwalker began to move toward my brother. Finally noticing this figure, my brother became paralyzed as I was. Closer and closer it drew, reaching its arm out toward my brother's head. Something finally snapped in me. I became unbearably angry. I broke from the trance and lunged at the skinwalker, raising my arms like a wild animal and baring my teeth at it. A growl came out that I never knew I could make. I became more angrier at the thing that it was trying to hurt us. It kept that smile at first, but the angrier I got, the more the smile faded. Finally, with everything I had, I began to make a primal roar at it. It fell backwards and ran into the night. Looking back at me, its eyes were dim and dull, its smile now long since gone. The next morning, my family returned home from the feast. After relaying the story to my parents, they quickly hired a medicine man. I'm half Navajo and half Mexican. For over 20 years of my life, I've lived on the Navajo Nation reservation in New Mexico. My Native American side of the family always warned us to be careful at night. My grandparents would always tell me stories of these shape-shifting witches who can curse you or mess with you. They called them skinwalkers, because they would take the skin of animals and wear them to change into that animal, or something in between a human and an animal. I never believed in it really. I'm only half Navajo and light-skinned, so I was never treated the same by most people here. So I drifted away from the culture and thought it wasn't for me. It was around summertime. This happened when I was in high school, so about 6 to 8 years ago. I would have been like 15 to 17 then. I used to hang out with a group of guys who liked to do a lot of delinquent type stuff. You know, smoke cigs and stay up all night playing video games at someone's house. Then at 3 a.m., if we felt like it, we would go sneak out to Paradise. I know, it's an ironic name. It's basically a giant metal pipe that carries irrigation water to all the farms. But really, it was also a spot for kids to get drunk or high in the evenings. However, the place did have a scary history of kids and adults who drowned in the night. But I always thought those were urban legends. But at 3 a.m., that was our time. We as boys would test one another across the pipe, sort of an initiation, to see how far you could go. We usually could go all the way across. Now keep in mind, this pipe goes well over 3 stories high. It's also wide. I'd say as wide as an average car. We would walk this thing for kicks in a group of 9 at 3 a.m. So one night, me and a small group of friends were driving around bored at 2 a.m., wanting to spook each other. So I said let's go to Paradise and walk the pipe. As to most of these friends I was hanging out with had never done it. They agreed, pumped up on energy drinks, and we drove. It was pretty quiet. The sky was dark and the night was cold. The boys with me were Michael, Cody, Tommy, and Theral. Now, Theral was the driver because he had a car and his family was pretty well off too, so he never had to worry about cash. We got to the place and he didn't want to go, said his parents were traditional, and he wanted to just chill in the car. Basically, he wanted to text some chick, I'm sure, without us bugging him. I told him it's fine, keep the car locked and running in case we see something scary. Me and the other boys went on without him. As we got onto the lead pipe, a few of the guys were scared and had me take the lead. As we crawled, I'd say a fourth of the way on the pipe, talking and laughing, I noticed a faint white or light gray bat bigger than my head flying around us. It dived for us a few times. We dodged it, but then Tommy slipped because of the shoes he was wearing and almost fell off the pipe. I reached out, grabbing him on his right arm. Michael had grabbed my shirt collar and Cody grabbed his. Altogether, we got back on the pipe, shaken that we almost lost Tommy to the dark depths below. The bat was gone. We were all freaking out, but the guys wanted to continue. We laughed about it as guys usually do. We passed the halfway point on the pipe with no problems, but as we got 3/4 of the way, Michael saw something. You see, at the end of the pipe there's a hill. Behind that hill, it's very brightly lit because of a church somewhere off in the distance. Anyway, on that hill was a black figure of pointy ears, a dog silhouette. Now, Michael was a tough guy. He yelled at that thing, "I'm not scared of you, Skinwalker," and tossed a few rocks he had in his pocket. One rock hit the pipe and the other fell into the brush below. That shadow silhouette dog stood up on its 2 legs like a person. We all freaked out, jaws dropped. Then Cody said, "Look, another one to the left." Tommy said there's another one on the right. So there's 3 silhouettes of pointy dog-eared people on the hill. I told them to back up so we could get back to the car. The things to the right and the left of the hill started to move down the hill towards us. Now there's just one standing on the hill, the one who stood up first. Now we're trying to go back, but we're still halfway. Under us, complete darkness. It's quiet for a few minutes. Then we heard a girl crying. Sounded like she was hurt and scared. We were overcome with a strange feeling of wanting to help. Michael wanted to go back towards the end and crawl down the pipe to help this girl. I almost followed too, but inside I said, "No, this is wrong. Something isn't right." So I yelled at him and everyone, saying, "Are you stupid? Look at the thing up there on the hill. Did you not see those things? It's a trap. Let's leave that fake crying. If that girl is hurt, we'll come back when the sun is up in 2 hours." Now, the moment I said this, the crying stopped. All the guys freaked out, saying they can't believe what came over them. They said they almost forgot what we saw before. Halfway on the pipe now, we hear a drum being played. We start running on this pipe, almost to the car. Corey stops us. We can all hear it, and it sounds like a pack of snarling, growling, yelping coyotes. But it's pitch dark below. But we know they are under us. We run, full speed. Not looking back in the car, we yell and drive as fast as we can back onto the dirt road to a well-lit gas station, and explained what happened to Theral. We couldn't get the girls crying out of our heads, and we went back in daylight just to make sure. We did not find the girl. Instead, in the area, we heard the crying and we saw a coyote watching us a close distance away. It was not shy. It looked at us for 4 seconds and walked into the brush. I did not go back there after that. This was about a year ago. I lived in Michigan. My older brother was planning a big cruise to Mexico and then invited me to go along. I agreed because I'd never left the country before, and I thought it would be a fun trip. So it was a day before the flight, and I went over to my cousin's to sleep, because our flight was very early and I live 40 minutes away. My cousin's backyard is completely woods with a small creek, and it's beautiful down there in the summertime. But it was about March when this happened, so the woods were very bare. It was getting late, and we were all starting to go to bed. I slept in the living room while my cousin went upstairs to bed with her husband and said goodnight. I was up, just facing the window to the woods because it always takes me a little bit to fall asleep. Then, very faintly, I saw a pair of glowing eyes off in the distance. My mind raced as I told myself it was just a deer, but the glowing eyes were getting closer and closer. Then I realized it wasn't a deer. The thing had to be at least 9 or 10 feet. I was horrified and paralyzed with fear. It looked like a big wolf or deer that had been decaying. The thing went back into the woods. That night I didn't sleep. When it was about 4, I heard my cousin's husband walking down the steps, and I told him about the whole thing that had happened that night. His eyes got very wide and said very quietly, "You seen a skinwalker." I've done some more research about these things, and I do believe I've seen a skinwalker. I never told anyone the story because I felt like I would be called a liar, but that was one of the scariest moments of my life. To start, I'm a white female. I was adopted 7 years ago by my Navajo family, and we've always been close despite my obvious cultural differences. Still, I learned about skinwalkers firsthand, and they've since then become an accepted part of my life. I left Utah at the end of 2012. The first story happened to my adopted uncle. He was driving through the canyon area. They live in Blanding, Utah, a spot not quite notorious for skinwalkers, but full of them nonetheless. It was dark outside, but the moon illuminated the canyon and brush, enough for him to see out of his side vision that something was running across the desert night. He was in his 40s, and at the time, he was a police officer, so a full-grown man. He started singing and praying in Navajo and kept his eyes on the road in front of him, but he was driving at least 55 to 60 miles per hour. So the shape running through the desert was keeping pace with him, despite his high speed. He said that it looked very vaguely human-shaped, but paler than any human that he'd ever seen. Still, he didn't look directly at it, and despite his singing, he was getting more and more scared. One thing my Navajo family always taught me was that these creatures feed on our fear. This one certainly seemed to. My uncle was shaking and sweating when this running thing picked up speed, outpacing his truck, and then it was maybe 30 yards ahead of him. It made a sharp right and began to run towards the road. He knew it was going to directly intersect him, and he made up his mind to put the foot on the gas. So it got closer and he sped up, and just as the two crossed paths, it jumped onto the road. He saw it for the first time then. He described it as a skinny man in jeans, with a plaid shirt, typical reservation wear, with a long face and big yellow eyes that looked like cat eyes. Its arms were thrown up over its head, and its hands were kind of flying behind it. The worst part was its mouth was open and seemed disconnected from its jaw. The chin was just flapping around, about a foot below its nose. It leapt onto the road and just as quickly jumped out of the way of the truck, and he didn't see it again. He prayed the whole way home, and they had a ceremony shortly after that. Another encounter happened to my adopted brother, who was one of the most level-headed and unshakable men I have ever met. He was 30 when this happened. He was at their dad's house, partaking in one of these ceremonies, which happens in a hogan. The rule is that you never leave the hogan alone, because the magic and energy that you make in one of those ceremonies is kind of like a supernatural light beacon. You never know what kind of creatures you're attracting. Still, Eric, my brother, was a pretty rational guy and wasn't afraid of the dark. He's been in the hogan for hours, chanting and praying and all that good stuff. He needed a smoke break and to take a leak. So against the general rule, he edged out of the round house and out into the night. There was nothing around except 15 or 20 parked cars, all close to the ceremony area. It was a large gathering, so Eric did his business with no incident and lit up a cigarette. He was standing there, staring off into space when he got that feeling of being watched. To shake it off, he walked away from the hogan about 20 feet and scanned the desert. Everything was quiet, except drums coming from the back of the tent and singing within. Just as he was about to shrug off his weird feeling and chuck his cigarette butt, he saw it. Under one of the vehicles, a dark shape with 2 shining eyes. The eyes were animal-like. They didn't glow on their own, but had reflective light in them, and they glinted right at Eric. They were yellow. The creature didn't have the shape of any animal he'd recognized, though. He explained it to me that it was shaped like Gollum, really skinny with a round human head. Eric walked towards the vehicle and bent down to get a closer look. Dust scrabbled around and he could hear a skittering noise. One bony arm shoved gravel his way, and the next thing he knew, the creature was gone and the vehicle was empty. But then he smelled this disgusting, puke-worthy stench. And he got scared then, because that's one of the worst things in Navajo culture. Bad smells are treated very seriously when they're assumed to be supernatural. So he straightened back up, and then he realized the source of the smell. A shadow fell over him, covering him from behind. He is around 6'2", so this thing, he said it was at least 7.5 feet. He was shivering and didn't move as it approached him from behind, until it was standing inches away. He could feel it. He could smell it. See its shadow. And then the worst thing, he felt it breathe on his neck. Eric said that it sounded like a horse or a cow when it snorts, and its breath was warm. When he looked at his feet, he saw his shoes, and behind his right foot, a big hoof. So he closed his eyes and started to sing, and right in that moment his dad and uncle got a terrible feeling from inside the Hogan. They bolted up and exited, calling his name. They found him shivering outside, too terrified to talk, and too terrified to stop singing in Navajo. It took Eric months before he shared this with us, and he did so expecting us to laugh or call him crazy, but I completely believe his story. This just happened mere seconds ago. I'm a 22-year-old female, of sound mind, pretty but not immaculate, average size, living in Oklahoma. I have a job and have never had anything that could be considered a mental episode. I live in Tulsa, the second largest city in the state. To give a little backstory, I live in a house with 4 roommates, all men. I think of them as brothers, and we never really worry about anything like intruders, and always have our 3 back doors unlocked. Now, to give you a visual aid, I live in the front part of the house, the living area, and 2 of the doors are the back doors to my roommates' rooms. The back doors lead out to a porch that overlooks our backyard. The backyard is large, though it's a pretty urban area. It snowed a few days ago, and there's still some snow on the ground, and it's freezing. But there's no smoking in the house. I put on my jacket and throw on some slippers. I grumble to my roommates about having to go outside to smoke alone, but trudge out our back doors anyways. I usually bring my phone or another person's, but this time I didn't. I've been bringing people because I've been hearing strange noises. I'm not the only one either. My other roommates have heard them as well. Sounds that resonate in our backyard, but seem to have no place. They sort of sound like chimes. The fence surrounding our yard is wood until about halfway up, and then the chain links start. So it's about 12:30 a.m. and I'm on the porch smoking when something catches my eye. Now, I have 2 cats in my house, my boy cat and my roommate's female cat. There's a cat that wanders around and tries to sneak in from time to time. And I notice this thing that caught my eye is close to the ground and wiggling. I assume it's the cat and start looking around for something to shoo it away. Finding nothing, I resort to building a snowball, and I throw it. A small one, nothing too big. I don't want to hurt it. I just want it to go on. So I throw the snowball and it hits it. It was then that I realized how big this thing was. As soon as the ball hit it, my entire body filled with an outstanding fear, one that I cannot explain. I was frozen. I watched this thing slowly stand up from the crouch that it was in. It looked like a man, but gross. Its knees was bent in the wrong way, and it had gross, sagging skin. It was unbelievably tall. Its arms were like twice as long as a person's. Its face was distorted, crinkled with the same wrinkles that creases its body. It looked at me, and I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. With an inhuman speed, it took off towards the back of my yard, and it was gone. My feet started moving again, and cigarette still in hand. I crashed through the doors into my house. I screamed to my roommates to lock the doors and tried to calm my trembling. I can't get the image of this thing out of my mind. I can't calm myself. They keep telling me that I'm tripping, and that can't be real. But it's Christmas, I'm not on any drugs, and I know what I saw. I'm terrified. What do I do? What did I see? Update: 1:43 a.m. I force my roommate to go outside with me, and there are prints in the snow. While I can't confirm that they are the creatures, they appear too large to be that of Tyler's or my own. My cats won't go anywhere near any of the doors, and when we were outside, we heard what sounded like a cat. But it's weird. It had an almost garbled undertone. The leaves were moving as well. I'm terrified. Update. Last night was the toughest night I've had in a long time. None of my roommates believe me, except for the one that's also seen a skinwalker. All night long there was this very strange tapping and scratching coming from the attic. I couldn't get more than 45 minutes of sleep at a time. While trading stories around a campfire, my friend recalled an encounter he had while serving an LDS mission. My friend's mission region had a reservation within its boundaries. However, it was relatively far from where he was serving. On occasion, him and his mission companion were asked to travel further than usual, to meet with some investigators. This took them near the reservation. On their way home, their car ran out of gas, and it wasn't until late that night that they were able to continue the journey home. My friend, who was driving while his companion slept in the passenger seat, chose a different route that took him through the back roads, in an attempt to get home sooner. He told us he was driving above the speed limit when he noticed movement in the woods lining the road. Because coyotes were common in the area, he took little notice at first. Then he looked out the window and slammed on the brakes. The sudden stop jolted his companion awake, who immediately wanted to know what was wrong. My friend was shaken, and he said he would tell him once they got home. He asked him to say a prayer. By the time they made it home, his companion was eager to know what happened. My friend told him, "I looked down the road next to the car and saw 6 men running on all fours, keeping up with the car. I was driving 40 miles an hour." I'm from southern Ohio. My particular neck of the woods was hilly and full of the Amish. I lived deep in the countryside with my father, who was stricken with frequent seizures and was unable to work or live alone. My story takes place early in the autumn of 2014. I was a 26-year-old college dropout at the time and working part-time at a gas station. Thanks to this, I had a lot of free time on my hands, most of which was spent hiking in the woods surrounding my home. On one of my many solo hikes, I saw something that changed me. As stated before, the seasons had just changed to autumn, and the trees were just starting to change into the many brilliant shades that time of year is known for. I had decided after one of my shifts at work to get one last extended hike in before the cold started to set in for the year. I had left the house around 2:30 p.m. and told my dad I'd be back around 7 p.m. for dinner. Warm sun but with a cooling breeze, remarkably low humidity, and not a cloud in the sky. Perfect weather for a hike. I had been walking alongside a creek using a large branch turned into a makeshift walking stick, my usual route, for around 45 minutes when I realized the woods were quiet. Too quiet. I stopped to listen, and aside from the running water to my right, there was not a sound in the forest. After shuddering from a chill I attributed to a breeze that had cut through the trees, I continued my trek, trying my best to match the silence of the woods with each step. Another 45 to 60 minutes passed, and my trail separated from the creek and began to loop back around towards my house. I had always dreaded this part of the hike due to the steep hills that laid before me, and stopped to take a breather. After resuming my hike, I had made it nearly 3/4 of the way through, when I felt a strong wind at my back, then a loud crack somewhere in front of me. About 40 yards ahead of me, and about 15 yards to the right of the trail, a young white-tailed buck stood alert, but unaware of my presence. After a few seconds of taking in the beauty of the creature, I noticed that the wind was still blowing, and thought it was strange that the buck hadn't noticed me. I had always heard that being upwind of a deer would ensure that you'd be noticed, and that the beast would flee. Shrugging it off, I continued walking, making sure to remain silent as to avoid spooking the buck. After walking about 15 yards, I noticed movement in the direction of the deer. Looking, I noticed he was no longer alert, and began walking slowly through the brush. But I noticed something else as well. The deer was now around 30 yards away from me, but in between us, close to the ground, there was a pitch-black mass moving under the cover of foliage. It was much closer to the buck and approaching him. He had yet to notice it. I froze, waiting to see what the strange creature was, as coyotes are the only common predator around here, and this was way too large and much too dark to be one of those. After the distance between the two forest dwellers shrunk to what couldn't have been more than 10 yards, the hidden beast stopped, and with it, the wind. Time seemed to freeze in that moment. The deer suddenly looked in the direction at me and flinched, as if it was going to sprint away, but before it could take so much as a step, a large black cat lunged at it. and instantly took the deer to the ground. While shocked at the appearance of this foreign predator, I remembered that there have been stories and eyewitness reports going around for the past couple of years of a large black mountain lion roaming the hills in my county. I could no longer see the animal through the brush, but I didn't need to see to know what it looked like. Quietly, I continued along my path, wanting to avoid disturbing the feasting feline. As I walked along, I realized I was getting a clearer view of the cougar. It was bigger than I expected, having only seen them on television or in books, and the color was mesmerizing, a deeper black than anything I'd ever seen, almost as if it was pulling the light towards it, never to escape. I stopped to marvel at the cat, and as I did, it began eating. I felt bad for the deer, but it was the circle of life and all. What felt like minutes couldn't have been more than a few seconds, and I was hit with a horrid smell attributed to the deer. I noticed that the cougar wasn't black all over. Its face and hands were the typical color. Wait, hands? Why did it have hands where the paws should have been? I began to study the creature more. Features which just seconds before were that of a large cat were becoming more human-like before my eyes. What was once a black cougar or mountain lion is now a large, bulky man with long black hair and covered in black furs for clothing, eating the deer raw with only his hands. I couldn't help but let out a quiet gasp, but it wasn't quiet enough. The man stopped and didn't move for a few moments. I knew I had to get out of there, but didn't want him to be able to follow me home. He hadn't looked in my direction yet, and as he was beginning to stand, without thinking I launched the stick I had been using to aid my hike back down the path in the direction I came from. After hearing the crash, the man sunk back down and began creeping in that direction, becoming a cat yet again as he moved. Taking my eyes off of him as little as possible, as fast as I could without making a noise, I continued along the path. Once I felt like I was far enough away, I broke into a sprint and didn't stop until I was through my back door. I haven't seen the man or cat since, but I quickly convinced my dad to move to Cincinnati and haven't been back to those woods, so who knows if he's still around. I knew about the Wendigo, skinwalkers, etc. before my encounter, but though it didn't cross my mind until a few months ago when I was retelling the story to my younger cousin at Halloween to scare him. The problem is my story doesn't match up to many skinwalker stories I've heard. In nearly all others, the skinwalker takes on the form of a dog or related animal, and my part of the country isn't exactly known for them. Anyone know what else it could have been if not a skinwalker? A few years ago, 2012 or 13 I think, since I was still in high school then, I was at a party with some friends, and as the night goes on, maybe 11 or 12 at night, one of my friends and I go outside to have a cigarette. The second we get out there, there's just this completely awful, foul smell, just like vomit and decay all at once. Now this was in the middle of nowhere, so we just figured it was an old animal, and went on having a cigarette. Less than a minute later, we hear something moving in the dark, and sure enough, a deer comes hobbling into the very edge of the porch light. But then I noticed something. One of its front legs was messed up in some way. I'm talking like broken in multiple places messed up. So my friend and I are slightly put off by this, and finish up our cigarette and go inside. However, right as we start to do that, one of the two porch lights goes pop and then goes out. So now there's less light outside and the deer goes back into darkness. So, a bit giddy, we both do a fake scared squeal at each other and turn around and go inside. And that's when we heard it. That undeniable sound of nails on the concrete patio. We both slowly turn around and see this hunched over, rotten coyote doing this very slow, unnatural crawl toward us. We go from 0 to 600, paralyzed with fear, almost instantly, until another one of our friends playfully pulls us through the open door, telling us to get back to the party. To this day, I have not experienced anything like that, and it's one of the most horrifying things I've ever experienced. When I was 17, I was living in a small town called Orange Grove in Texas. It was a main city, but I lived in the outskirts, so it had no lights, and it's really, really dark and freaky. There are so many stories about this place and the town next to it, but I never thought I would be able to tell a story myself. It was around mid-December and about midnight. I had just had a fight with my mom and walked out to the road to calm down. The roads there were narrow and rocky, and next to it is a cornfield. Thankfully, it was empty. But on the right side of me, there was a row of large trees that blocked out most of the land, and you can't really see anything. After walking for about 15 minutes, I started to hear a strange sound. It sounded like a bunch of whistles and howls. And of course, I started to get scared. I was tempted to turn around, but I was still pissed off and I didn't want to go back to my mom's. I was on the phone with my grandfather, whom was on his way to come pick me up. I figured I would just wait for him, but then my phone suddenly cut off and it said low battery, which is weird because I remembered charging it. I put my phone in my pocket and looked toward the trees. At this point, I was stopped and standing in an empty cornfield since it was closer to the road, and a single street light. The light was low. As I was waiting, I could see a car approaching. They had their high beams on, and it was those really bright ones where the car doesn't even have to be close, and you can see everything. It was at that moment I saw it hiding on the side of a tree. I nearly threw up at the sight of this thing. Its body looked about the size of a cow, but its head and neck were long. It had wavy hair throughout its neck and on top of its head, like it was a person. The rest of the body was a lighter color and didn't look right. I heard those howls and whistles again, and I saw it making its way across the road. I was not as scared because I figured the car would see it and either hit it or stop and look at it, and I can just run back. But the car turned into one of the streets, and this thing was just walking to where I was. I ran to the street lamp and even past it. A few seconds later, this thing comes walking into the light, and I can see it clearly now. Its face looked like it was human, but the mouth was elongated like a snake or a dragon, and its mouth was covered with teeth. I nearly puked and started crying. My life flashed before my eyes, and I heard its howl begin to get closer. It must have been a miracle or something, but my grandfather drove up the road just behind me and told me to get in after shouting. After all of this happened, I asked him if he knew what that thing was, and he didn't say anything. He just drove me to his house and never mentioned it. The next day, I told my brother, and he thought it was funny, until later that night I heard a kitten meowing at his window. It's weird because my brother and his girlfriend have a weakness for cute things, and we're about to go out and find it, but for some reason I felt uneasy and said just wait and leave it. We could hear something meowing, getting lower and lower, until it got demonic, and it was just a long meow with some other sounds and whistles. Then it stopped and we heard a loud scratch and a bang at the window. I didn't sleep at night for months after this. It wasn't until my friend Colin, who took interest in it, told me that his sister had been seeing something like that, in the same road that I had about 4 nights after I had seen it, and that it tried to run her off the road. Then another friend said she would see something peeking out of the cornfields when it was full, and he could see something very large crashing through it. About a week later, Colin went to the police station to ask about the road, and learned there were a lot of open investigations of missing people spanning from 10 years back. To this day, I never go down that road at night, and I'll never forget what I saw. So when I was 4 years old, I lived in a small neighborhood, decently wooded. I would have terrible nightmares in this house. I would always have the same dream. I'd be outside facing the woods and see a towering black figure. I never could see anything other than the outline, and I'd be in a panic and slowly walk to my house and look at myself sleep, like it would be an out-of-body experience, and I'd wake up sweating. So after I had this dream 5 or so times, I awoke to a tapping at my window, and had an awful stench fill my nose, and I heard a voice. It was more in my head though, saying something like come outside. And I walked to my door, and I saw the gigantic figure from my dream, peering through me with yellow eyes, and I passed out from fright at the moment. I woke up on the floor at 6 a.m., and I thought I had dreamed it, and went back to bed, being the little kid I was. This experience dubbed my anxiety. It happened about 4 months ago. I lived in the Texas Panhandle. I was in my room talking to my girlfriend at the time. She's of Navajo descent, and I had my window open, and I heard what sounded like an old-time radio static, and smelled rotting meat, so I looked out my window and saw a coyote, standing 7 feet tall on its back legs looking around, so I shut and locked everything up. I heard tapping on the window for the rest of the night. I told my girlfriend what happened the next morning, and she came over and blessed me and the house and everything in it. Then she blessed herself and her household, and I haven't seen one since. When I was about 5 years old, I used to live in an isolated region in Arizona, in the Navajo reservation near a little town called Steamboat. The land belonged to my great-grandmother, and not much was built there, only a couple houses and some graves. I used to love it there, me just running around with all of this land to explore. I lived there with my 2 brothers and 1 sister, mother, stepfather, and great-grandma. Being Navajo, I commonly used to hear the term skinwalker, and how they can curse people just by taking such things like the victim's hair, urine, nails, and saliva. I never really thought much about it though, until that one night. It was a typical, busy, cold night. My parents left somewhere for the night with my great-grandmother, and my older brother and sister headed into town. All there was me and my brother, who was about 7 at the time. I decided to go to sleep, being ordered to by my mom, who had just left minutes after I fell asleep. Being asleep, I was alarmed by what seemed to be knocks at my window. I didn't really think much about it. Instead, I tried to fall back asleep, hoping my mom returns back soon. I go back to sleep. I woke up in shock. Barks coming from all around the house. These didn't sound like our dogs we had at the ranch, as all of them sounded exactly the same when compared to each other. It sounded like 4 or 5 surrounding the house. I was scared. Being only 5, I had no idea what to do. Those 5 minutes of hiding under the blanket crying as 4 or 5 coyotes surround the house. I looked in the living room and the TV was on with my stepdad sleeping. Made my way into the living room and tried to wake up my mom. She wakes up with the barking continuing. Just go to sleep, they'll go away. I try to sleep, crying, scared, traumatized. The next morning was strange. No sleep, no acknowledgement. No one was talking about it. It was like it never happened. Mom remembers it, but she doesn't talk about it. My stepfather runs into the house. The sheep. We rushed outside, leaving our food behind, and what happened to our sheep was devastating. They were all gone. No trace. Nothing. So far, I'm clueless in why the sheep were gone, and where those coyotes came from. The first thing that I can remember of that night was it was a cold, crisp evening out in the pasture. The grass was tall and crunched beneath me with every footstep. I saw a dried red trail and I thought it was a deer that had been injured. I brushed it off. I kept walking until about midnight, and it was even colder than when I started. I had walked for miles and was about to turn home. I felt a presence, so I looked back and saw my friend smiling at me. I could smell a horribly putrid smell coming from the direction of him, with every gust of wind. I didn't think much of it. I asked him what he was doing here. With his small, quiet voice, he replied, "I thought I would just drop by and join you on a walk." He usually doesn't walk with me, so that's when I began to become curious about what he was really doing here. I began to catch up with him because I haven't seen him in a week or 2. I asked him a few questions, and of course, he replied. It didn't really sound like him though. I finished my walk and he went away. Later, as I was laying in bed, I thought about attending a funeral. I couldn't exactly remember whose it was. I left that thought and went to a happy one, and then drifted into slumber. The next day seemed pretty normal. I woke up, ate breakfast, etc. I even went into town to grab a few things from the store, like some gas, groceries, and other stuff like that. I came home and stocked my pantries, and sat down to see what was on the news. I found out that a man went missing. I didn't hear the name or see the picture because the TV lost signal. I started to feel uneasy. I didn't know what for. I thought I would just keep that to myself. It sounded like a good idea, so I stuck with it. I carried out the rest of my day normally. Later, I got ready to go for a walk. It was getting dark out, so I grabbed my flashlight and headed out. A few hours passed, and it was really dark outside. My friend appeared out of nowhere, and then began talking like normal. He still smelled terrible and wasn't acting right. I began to think back to what I thought the night before. I remembered I was going to my friend's funeral. He had been missing. He died. How was he here right now? I put 2 and 2 together and finally realized what was before me. From all those stories I've heard, skinwalkers tend to stink terribly, and they take on the shape of whatever animal or person they got to. The head looks very much like my friend's. I realized that when it started to grow its legs out. It says, "You look like you saw a ghost," with an expression that had been a mix of anger and adrenaline. It was what a killer looks like before they get somebody. I saw all the skin that was previously on it melt off, and it turned into a 10-foot tall gray thing. And when it turned slowly back to its bony structure, I just stood there, almost to the point of insanity with fright. It stared into the deepest part of my soul, and I felt it. With all of my might, I ran off into the forest. That thing followed me. I found a trail that led deeper into the trees. My flashlight beam was dancing side to side while I ran. It was one of the most hypnotizing things to me. It was until I stumbled and almost fell. I hastily regained my balance and kept running. It was getting harder to see. My flashlight, the batteries were wearing out on it. I had to find a place to hide or tire this thing out enough so I could change the batteries. I knew that thing was just trying to tire me out, because it didn't look like it was straining at all. It looked like it could do that for hours at a time, so that told me my second option wasn't a choice for consideration. After about 100 yards of sprinting, I took a sharp corner and climbed up a tree real fast, and it kind of worked. That thing was puzzled on where I went. I didn't realize it, but I had my hand over my mouth trying not to make a sound. It screeched. I had goosebumps so big, my shirt shrunk 2 sizes. It sent shivers down my spine and made the hairs on the back of my neck stand straight up. It sounded like a bird with the screech of a demon mixed together. I could not believe how it sounded. I had only heard something like that once before, when my teacher would put her nails on the chalkboard and slide them. I silently changed the batteries on my flashlight and reassembled it. I took off one of the old batteries and chucked it into the woods further off. I heard it crashing in the distance and heard the thing take off after it. It sounded like it was a car on the highway. It just took off. I climbed down and ran in the opposite direction of which I threw the battery. I turned my flashlight back on and started going faster. There were some deer running behind me. I thought nothing of it and went on. That thing came up from behind and got one of the deer. I stopped to catch my breath. The dust from the path had kicked up and now blinded me from the view of that thing, and hopefully it had lost all sight of me too. I was wrong. I heard those same words coming from nowhere but everywhere at once. It had a slight echo to it. In a faint whisper I heard, "You look like you saw a ghost. How about I comfort you?" From the thick dust, it jumped down next to me from above. It screeched and ran after me. I had already started running. I had tried to jab a stick into it, but it stayed alive and full of energy. I got lucky. It got tired. It stopped after hours of running. I found a stream. I took a few sips from its clean, fresh water. I sat down on a stump. It was soaked. I turned my flashlight on and looked where I had been sitting. It was red, smelled like iron, and was dripping. It was coming from my leg. The skinwalker got it. I took the sock off and tied it around my leg. It burned, but the dripping slowed. I knew I better get a move on before something else happens. I was in the middle of the field when I heard a screech. I just ran home. I was soon there and the gash was bad. I got some rubbing alcohol and poured it on there. It burned like a fuse of a firework on the 4th of July. I got some water, then rinsed it out. I felt a little burn from the alcohol, but not much more. The sun was coming up, so I made some coffee and went into my Saturday and got out of there. I have told this story many times over and almost nobody believes me. I was almost put into a padded room with a straitjacket on because they thought I was crazy. That was until they saw the scar. There was almost nothing that could match the look of that gash. It had the signature mark from a skinwalker. I say again, almost nothing could match it. I remember back to this night sometimes and wonder to myself, what would have happened if I stopped? That never leaves my mind. Sometimes when I'm asleep, I dream back to that night when I was awakened. I have that same feeling of being watched. I feel like I'm being stalked. I still hear those footsteps and screeches coming from the dark forest every once in a while. There's nothing like them. This happened when I was 15 years old. I had an aunt and uncle, and they lived on a rural farm in the middle of Washington in a small town. My grandmother lived in a cottage about 100 feet from the main house, and my grandma had a dog named Maggie, and she's about 11 years old. I had my mom make my bed on the couch, and this house was very small. Every part could be seen from the front window, and I was right underneath that. The window had a view of a road with tall pine trees behind it, so I finally drifted off to sleep as my family were all watching a movie. I woke up and everything was dark out, but the thing was I heard the dog walking around. I brushed it off and decided to get up to go to the restroom, and I realized there was no dog and my grandma's room was closed. and the dog always sleeps with her. It hit me like a truck. So the restroom was unfortunately on the other side of the house in the far corner of the property. I decided to just go behind a tree because I was going outside. I crept into my grandmother's room and grabbed the dog. As we walked out the door, the dog started to whimper, and she ran out of the door to the edge of the road and just stared into the woods. I yelled for her to get back, but she wouldn't. She just sat and stared. I had to go and grab her to drag her back into the house. When I reached her, I decided to look where she was, and I saw nothing. So I went to the restroom and went back into the house. I put Maggie back into my grandma's room and went to sleep. It was about 3:14 a.m. But I woke up sometime later by the sound of a dog walking again. So I got up and saw that my grandma's room was open. So I thought it was Maggie. But then I looked and the front door was wide open and I froze in fear. Then I found the courage to look outside. So I went and walked through the door, and I saw a trail of red leading from the door to the road. I followed the trail into the woods, and then I saw Maggie in a tree, and I looked at what was holding her. It was a tall-looking man, I thought at first, but it had very distorted features, and then I realized it looked like a deer. I froze and ran back into the cottage. I was so scared, I yelled for my family, and they ran out of the rooms, and I explained what I had seen to them. So my dad went out and I followed them, and he froze in fear before me, and he turned around and ran back into the house. I chased him and he had told me what he had seen and described the same thing as me the next day. We packed up and left and haven't been back since. A few years ago, 2012 or 13 I think, since I was still in high school then, I was at a party with some friends, and as the night goes on, maybe 11 or 12 at night, one of my friends and I go outside to have a cigarette. The second we get out there, there's just this completely awful, foul smell, just like vomit and decay all at once. Now this was in the middle of nowhere, so we just figured it was an old animal, and went on having a cigarette. Less than a minute later, we hear something moving in the dark, and sure enough, a deer comes hobbling into the very edge of the porch light. But then I noticed something. One of its front legs was messed up in some way. I'm talking like broken in multiple places messed up. So my friend and I are slightly put off by this, and finish up our cigarette and go inside. However, right as we start to do that, one of the two porch lights goes pop and then goes out. So now there's less light outside and the deer goes back into darkness. So, a bit giddy, we both do a fake scared squeal at each other and turn around and go inside. And that's when we heard it. That undeniable sound of nails on the concrete patio. We both slowly turn around and see this hunched over, rotten coyote doing this very slow, unnatural crawl toward us. We go from 0 to 600, paralyzed with fear, almost instantly, until another one of our friends playfully pulls us through the open door, telling us to get back to the party. To this day, I have not experienced anything like that, and it's one of the most horrifying things I've ever experienced. I live in the mountains about 10 miles outside of a small town, near a winding backroad highway well known for its many accidents, a lot of which happen to be collisions with animals, deer, small rodents, and sometimes more often than not, mountain lions. I grew up in the country my whole life, so I've seen just about every animal my side of the state has to offer, whether alive or roadkill. Recently, I saw one that I could neither identify or rationalize. My husband and I had stopped by for dinner with his coworkers in town down the winding road from our home. Once it grew close to midnight, I knew we should be getting home. My husband insisted he wanted to stay a little bit longer to have a drink with his buddy. Reluctantly, I agreed he could stay, even though he knows I hate going home late at night by myself. We have about a half a mile of driveway leading to our home, which is blocked off by a padlocked gate. I get paranoid every time I have to get out of my car to unlock the gate pull inside, and then relock the gate behind me. Not that I'm afraid of something attacking me, but way up in the country a wild animal mauling me. The number of mountain lions and bears in our area was definitely above average. I headed back home alone, my husband promising he'd only be out for another hour. I took the dangerous road extra cautiously in the evening. The thick cover of trees surrounding the road made it pitch black. After finally arriving at my road, I hit the gravel fast, eager to get inside. What I saw next made me slam on my brakes so hard I fishtailed a bit and scattered gravel every which way. What I saw barely 2 feet in front of my car was incomprehensible. It looked almost like a human figure at first. Its ribs stuck out so far it took a barrel shape. It was hunched over, but if it stood up straight it had to be at least 8 feet tall. Tufts of matted hair all over its body. What skin shone through appeared to be mangled. Long limbs resembling human arms, but too thin and discolored. Its legs arched like wolves. It had no sign of a human face. The face it had seemed to be a snout that contained a sharp set of canine teeth that shone and snarled at me. My eyes locked with its piercing yellow eyes. It stared me down for what felt like an eternity. Then all of a sudden it broke our gaze, swiftly disappearing into the woods. I was so scared I sat in my car until my husband arrived home after an hour later. He had to knock on my window to get my attention. He questioned me about it once we were in the safety of our own home. I've been dealing with paranormal experiences with spirits since I was a child, but my husband says he has never seen me this shook up before. I'll take a ghost over that creature any day. This is a story I was told by one of the other guides who had spent around 6 years guiding canoe trips in the Lake of the Woods. Let's call him Steven. I want to remind you that I did not experience this, but Steven had told me about a few experiences he and the other guides he worked with had. What I do want you to know is that we do not joke around about Wendigos or skinwalkers at our workplace. We do not tell these stories to our campers anymore, and we don't even say their name but refer to them only as W or S. This is not something that we joke about, or just make up to scare campers. I'm not an expert in Wendigos or skinwalkers or Native American culture by any means, and I hope not to offend anyone, but the knowledge that I have on them has been passed down by guides and their experiences. One detail that I should explain before I tell Steven's story is that a definite way to tell that you are seeing a Wendigo or a skinwalker is if the animal or creature has 2 bright, glowing red or yellow eyes. One summer about 5 to 6 years ago, Steven had a couple encounters with the Wendigo. His first encounter was on an earlier trip in the summer, where their destination was into Shoal Lake. It was a 6-day trip, which had about 60 miles of paddling, and taking your packs and canoes over the land to another lake, into Shoal. On day 4, they were going out of Shoal, through a portage called Headman's Portage. Sounds made up from some scary story. No idea why they call it that, but it's quite fitting. There was a campsite that is pretty frequently used about half a mile from the portage. We just called the campsite Headman's. Steven and his trip left Shoal Lake aiming to get through Headman's Portage and stay at the campsite right after it. It's a little long, but a nice highway of portage without too many ups and downs. I believe the Canadian Park Service even clears out this portage, which may be the only one that is frequently maintained in the Lake of the Woods. The short paddle from the portage to the campsite is just surreal and beautiful. It's through a little stream, with 10 to 15 foot cliffs on both sides covered in moss and beautiful cedars. Steven and his trip got to Headman's campsite, and later on, just before they were going to bed, they discovered they left their sleeping bag at the end of the portage. It was around 9, so it was getting pretty dark by this point. Steven and a camper set off in a canoe with their headlamps quickly to retrieve the pack. The paddle took them about a half hour, and at this point you could really only see what your headlamp was shining on. They grabbed the bag and started to head back. Shortly after leaving, Steven started to hear loud splashes and things falling from the water behind them. He dismissed it at first because beavers are pretty common in this area, and when they slap their tails it sounds pretty identical to a huge rock being chucked into the water. But the splashes kept going, and were right on his back as they kept paddling. Steven looked behind him to see a huge rock around the size of a baseball come flying at him and land into the water at his side. They began to paddle like crazy to get back to the campsite and away from whatever was chucking these giant, super heavy rocks at them. Steven looked back between the paddles, and on one of the cliffs about 15 feet up, he saw 2 distinct red glowing eyes on top of it. The rocks stopped and they made it back okay. The rest of their trip went along nicely without any other occurrences. But I never feel great about going through Headman's Portage, and triple check that I don't have any bags there when I do. This story takes place about 2 years ago. My aunt, married into the family, has cousins, not related to me, who live on a farm in LaPointe, Utah, on a reservation, and thought it would be fun to have all us other cousins go stay with her for a few days and see the Dinosaur National Monument. My aunt's grandmother had recently passed away, and her house was basically empty, so we went to stay there. It was a pretty old house to say the least. It was made out of painted white cedar blocks and was pretty run down, but we were only staying there a few days, so we didn't care how luxurious it was. The front door led into a small kitchen, and off the kitchen to the right was a small room with a TV, 2 couches, and a chair. Off of that room was a larger living area with 2 more pull-out couches and a door leading to the side of the house. Off the living room was a hall that led into 2 small bedrooms and a bathroom. It was a pretty small house considering we had around 18 people staying there. Along with the old and empty house we were staying in, there were 2 other houses on the property belonging to my aunts, cousins, and their families. These were the only houses for about 2 miles. There were 12 kids in total, ranging from 3 to 16, me being the oldest, as well as the 2 other kids who lived in the other houses who wanted to come stay with us. We all slept on the pull-out couches and the floor. Other than the parents, there were 2 other people who were staying there. They were soon to be married, so they were staying there for a few days before the wedding. It was a whole big mess of people, but bear with me. They didn't want to sleep in the same house because they weren't married, and religion and all this crap. So the guy, we'll call him B, was sleeping in the small camper outside while his fiancée slept in one of the bedrooms. Now we can actually get to the creepy stuff. On the first night we were there, me and one of my cousins were on the pull-out couch in the first little room, while all the other kids were either on the other couches or on the floor, in either our room or the other. It was about midnight. Most of the kids were already asleep. We were watching Disney movies and dozing off when we started to hear strange noises outside toward the field. It sounded like low growling and panting, but not entirely like it was coming from an animal. There was just this weird human-like sound to it. I assumed it was some sort of stray animal and got up to see when one of the other kids who lived next door, we'll call him L, jumped up and told me just to ignore it and go to sleep. I was really confused and the noises were still happening, but the terrified look on his face told me I should listen. The creature would pace around the house and stop at the door by the kitchen for a few minutes before continuing to circle the house. Neither of us got any sleep that night. The next night was basically the same setup. Kids sleeping everywhere, movies playing, a few people still dozing off. I was exhausted from the night before and managed to fall asleep when I was woken up by one of the youngest kids quietly crying and crawling into bed with me. We'll call him A. I asked him what was the matter, and he said he was scared by the big dog outside the window. I turned to L and asked if they had a dog. He looked completely scared out of his mind and said no, and told me to ignore it once again. I stayed up for a while after that, watching movies with A, when he asked me to walk with him to the bathroom. A little bit of explanation before I continue. This house was shaped like a short L, the bottom part being the kitchen and the 2 living rooms, and where it turns was the hallway with the bedrooms and the bathroom. The bathroom was right at the beginning of the hall. There was a small window to where you could see the wall, where the first living room was, straight ahead, along with a window that you could see through into the living room, where we were sleeping, and then the rest of the house to the left. Anyways, I was walking A to the bathroom and switch on the light when I see it. An extremely tall, dog-like creature standing on its hind legs facing the window looking into the living room. Its fur was matted and its eyes seemed to be almost glowing orangish red. Its hands looked human-like, but with dark fur and long claws. I screamed and the creature ran back around the side of the house on its hind legs. I picked up A and carried him back to the living room to quickly find L closing the curtains. "What was that?" I whispered to L. "I don't know." "If you ignore it, it'll go away," he whispered back. "You've seen it before?" "Only a couple times, but not recently." Our talking woke up Elle's younger sister, and surprisingly, nobody else. I'm guessing she knew what was going on because she seemed just as scared as we were. I sat A down on the bed and turned the TV up louder, drowning out the sounds of the creature was making outside, and hoping to calm A down a bit and take our minds off whatever the hell we just saw. The noises circling the house continued for about another half hour, when they stopped at the back door in the other room. I peered my head around the corner to face the door. The door handle on the first door started to move back and forth. You could see the silhouette of something huge behind it. I rushed over to shut and lock the other door, trying not to wake anyone else. Just as I did, B, guy sleeping in the camper outside, also Elle's uncle, burst through the kitchen door, slamming it behind him. L asked B what was going on, but he didn't want to say another word and rushed down the hall and into the bedroom with his fiancée. He came out holding a shotgun and pulled a chair into the corner of the living room, giving him a view of both the kitchen and the back door. He gave us a look of both terror and anger. He told us to go back to sleep. We didn't. He sat there all night until the noises stopped around sunrise, then went back outside into the camper without saying a word. I'm surprised no one else woke up, and no one else knows what happened that night. The next morning, there were huge paw prints around the house, and B was discussing something with L's dad, who lived in one of the other houses. They both looked concerned and scared. It was very unsettling. We left later that day for reasons I can't remember, but I'm glad we did. I didn't want to spend another night in that house, and I'm pretty sure that what we saw that night was a skinwalker. This story belongs to a friend of mine. He told me this once and I simply have to tell it. My friend is of Native American heritage, a tribe who settled the North Pacific West Coast. He is quite the character. For one, he is a whopping 6'10", and he has the blackest eyes you could imagine. He always has this frowning face going on, which makes him seem even more intimidating. He is everything but a bad guy. In fact, he is the most gentle of giants. He was working at a gas station up north back in 1992, and he pretty much always worked the graveyard shift from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. Business wasn't exactly booming at nights, so he was usually watching TV or reading magazines between customers, and there were a few. The area he lived and worked in was deeply associated with all things Native American. There was a potent sense of pride in the surrounding communities, but also a very distinct presence of superstition and old traditions. My friend was no exception. He was a firm believer of the ways of old. This made his encounter even more terrifying. One night, he was sitting as usual, watching TV when a customer entered the gas station. The customer paid for his gas, a pack of smokes, and some soda and returned to his car. Nothing unusual. But my friend looked out the window toward the customer's car, and he spotted what looked like a huge dog sitting by the edge of the woods. Now, the window was located on the side of the building, some distance from the door, overlooking the pumps and the roof covering it. On the sides of the roof are pretty strong lights, which shine into the gas station. This gives the gas station not only an eerie lighting with the blinds casting long, striped shadows, but also blinds the teller to an extent. As he peered through the window trying to focus on the dog, it was gone. He didn't think much of it, even if it was a wolf. He was inside, and wolves don't tend to rob gas stations at night. Wolves were common here, but this wolf was huge. He brushed it off and returned to his mindless watching of TV. A couple of hours go by and not a single customer has entered since the last one. He was just about to refill some condiments when he heard a large thud coming from the back. It wasn't inside, he could hear that, but it came from the back. And behind the building they kept the garbage. The gas station had been visited before by the scavenging homeless, but my friend didn't really care. It wasn't his garbage, and it was just garbage. Let them take it. But it kept getting louder. He decided to grab a flashlight and a gun from the office and circle around back to tell whoever ventured there to leave. His presence alone would have scared off anyone, but he wanted to feel safe just in case. He exited through the sliding doors, walking past the window he was just sitting by. As he turned the corner, he shines a light towards the dumpsters. As the cone of light hits the dumpsters, my friend instantly drops the flashlight and the gun. It's the huge dog he saw before, scouring through the garbage. It wasn't a dog, though. It clearly stood on its hind legs, reaching the same height as him. It couldn't be a bear, as it was too gaunt. The creature's eyes had been glowing in the light of the flashlight, making it even more terrifying. He ran inside the gas station and wasn't followed. He locked the door, stayed inside the whole night, and quit the next day. My friend is convinced that he saw a skinwalker, a shape-shifting shaman of sorts, which are a common occurrence in the Native American lore and culture. It's just a really creepy story. I'm not sure what to think of what happened. I may just be overthinking things, or my sister may have just been joking with me. I figured I would share my small story here, in case anyone had any insight on what happened. However, I don't quite believe anything is monstrous, as I suspect to be at fault. I probably just misheard. For perspective, I will tell you that I live out of the southern part of British Columbia, Canada. I live a good hour and a half away from the nearest town by car, and my home is completely surrounded by forest with a few distant neighbors. It is not uncommon for us to see and hear coyotes, wolves, bears, and cougars, so we have a large dog for protection. However, the latest dog passed on, so our new protector is just a puppy and she's not very brave just yet. and I don't think she could have helped the situation if she wanted to. It happened the summer after my graduation. I got a call from one of my neighbors asking if I could tend to her garden while her and her husband went on a fishing trip. I took the walk down the hill with my dog through the brush so that she could lay out the details of specific care her plants would need. My family has known this woman since we moved into our home 20 years ago, and as children we would all go down and visit her, make her cards and chat, and she would allow us to play in her swimming pool in the summer. I trust her completely and have house sat for her before, so it was no odd request for my sister and I to go help out. The garden was new and absolutely beautiful. I have a garden of my own, but it was nothing compared to hers, which was gated and was in pristine condition. The mosquitoes were horrid, so she made her instructions short and I retreated back up the hill to inform my little sister of our assignment. The first day was terribly hot. My sister and I attempted to get up early to evade the heat and bloodsuckers, but in the end they were all sitting in the shade waiting for us to arrive. It took a full hour and a half to completely soak the entire garden, and by then we were sweating, bloody, itchy and irritable from all of our newfound bite marks. We were supposed to water the garden every morning so that the sun wouldn't dry up the water throughout the day. So I got up early to wake my sister, who after yesterday's assignment refused to go down with me, protesting that she wanted to sleep in and to leave her alone. Not wanting to be held responsible for the demise of my neighbor's veggies, I reluctantly trotted down the path to my neighbor's. Both my dogs were off on some squirrel-infested adventure, so my trek was made alone. Only a few birds that morning until I made it farther down, and the closer I got, the quieter it became. My attention, however, was on the sun, and I wanted to finish my task ASAP. When I was almost done, I took a stretch and went to turn off the hose, wiping the sweat from my forehead. Across the field, from the garden, I thought I heard a person, which would have been very odd, so I stood still to listen. What I heard was my sister calling my name in a shrill voice. My sister and I would often call each other in strange exaggerated screeches and voices in just that particular way. I knew for a fact that my sister is far too lazy to hike all the way down and sneak through the brush across the field just to yell at me. I listened again but heard nothing. Finishing up, I assumed I had just misheard, believing it to have been a bird or something, though the odd happening struck in my mind. Later on, I referred the account to my sister, who laughed and joked with me that this must have been the creature her friend told her about. The creature she was referring to was called Wendigo or Skinwalker. I honestly don't know the difference between the two. I don't know what these creatures are or if they actually exist, but if they were to, they're supposed to live in this kind of area. I put it out of my mind anyway, not believing in such things. The next day I was with my sister tending the garden and my dog came down to see us. I was shocked to see her paw was all bloody, thinking that she had cut herself on a piece of sheet metal. I ran with her back up to the house to see if I could clean and fix it. My sister didn't want to come up with me, so she stayed in the garden to finish up watering her part. It turned out the blood on my dog's paw was not her own, and that she had simply caught an unfortunate pack rat, whom she delightedly tore to pieces. When I came back, my sister wasn't in the garden. Confused, I began to walk to my neighbor's house when she came outside to meet me. She told me she had heard her name being called from across the field in my voice, in the same way I heard mine. She was visibly spooked and insisted we go back up to our house and leave the garden for tomorrow. I refused and told her she could go up without me if she wanted, but I had to finish the garden. I suspected she was only kidding with me, and I was waiting for her to give up right away, like she normally would. Instead, she stayed with me, holding her arms, and refused to walk home alone. Once we finished, we both came back together for the next 3 mornings to water the garden, and no other occurrences happened. To this day, my sister claims she wasn't lying. I'm not sure if these creatures are supposed to be smart enough or talented enough to pull off stunts so specific. We have lived in the same house in the middle of the woods for our whole lives, and we can be loud and silly without fear of annoying anyone. But if someone or something had been close enough to listen, they definitely had plenty of time to do so. Also, how these occurrences only happened when we were alone gives me goosebumps. If you have any answers for me, I would appreciate any info you have. I won't reveal who I am or much about where I live, and to be honest, it's been a few months since this happened, but I just came to terms with it now, and I have to warn people about what's out there, what they knew, what we don't. Warning, this is a very long read and some of the content below is very disturbing, but I can't hold back, so here's my story. Occasionally, I like to go hiking with my friends. There's not much more to do, honestly. We live in a small mountain town in Colorado. It was fun at first, but by now, we know the trails by heart. By the end of the summer, there was only one we hadn't tried. Now, there's a reason for that. The trail goes right through a portion of the forest that the Ute people consider to be sacred. I'll admit, I have hang-ups when it comes to these things. You don't wear hats in church, you don't let the American flag touch the ground, you don't trudge all over somebody's sacred land for the fun of it. Still, my friend, we'll call him Mark, convinced me to go. He said that regardless of whether I went, he'd go anyway, and since no one else was going, he managed to get me to go with him. That's one of my other hang-ups. Don't go hiking alone. Don't let friends go hiking alone. Too many tragic news stories start that way. So I ended up going with him reluctantly. The whole way there, he was talking about how this was the coolest trail he'd ever been on. Yes, he'd been there before, though only once. His ploy had been to get me to come with him, so he could show me. He admitted this in the casual way that friends admit being jerks to friends. Sometimes I didn't blame him. I had a tendency to have a stick up my butt, and what followed only reinforced it. We arrived at about 9, I remember, giving us plenty of time. It was farther away from the town than most trails, and it wasn't near a paved road, so there was a lot of walking just to get there. No tourists knew about it. A lot of locals and even some Ute didn't know about it. But if you followed a game trail through a bunch of trees, it would widen out and lead its way through some mountains, densely forested terrain. What struck me was how quiet it was. This, apparently, was what Mark found so awesome. For some reason, in this particular place, you couldn't hear any birds chirping or any wildlife whatsoever. It was complete and utter silence. Eventually, I had to go to the bathroom and I stepped off the main road, just so Mark wouldn't see me. As I was going, I spotted something through the trees. It looked like some sort of clearing, just past the shallow creek, with a log going over it. My curiosity got the better of me and I looked at the log. It didn't seem to be an act of nature. It was a makeshift bridge, I was sure. True enough, when I tested it, it seemed to be stable. I put one foot in front of the other and crossed. When I reached the other side, I pulled my way through some trees and saw the first image of the day that I will never forget. Though to many, it wouldn't have seemed like much. In front of me, there was vegetation, trees, ferns, brush, but suddenly, it all stopped. Within a perfect circle, surrounded by small, perfectly arranged rocks, there was nothing but smooth dirt. It was strange, not in the least because the shape of the rocks was absolutely perfect. They were partially submerged in soil and fit together like bricks. Every single one of them was the same uniform white color, and as I got closer, I saw things had been carved on them, symbols. They were old, very old. Even if I had understood them, their distinct shapes had been lost over the years. That was strange, but what disturbed me was that this circle wasn't actually perfect. On one edge, just one, a group of rocks had been kicked up. They were scattered around, as if they actually had been in a perfect brick wall, and something shattered them. In this area, the otherwise perfectly smooth dirt had been kicked up. There was something about it that just unsettled me. As quiet as the entire forest was, it felt quieter here. I quickly turned around and went back to Mark, who made some lame old number 2 joke. I should have forced him to leave right there. Instead though, we kept going. After all, the day was only half over. While the forest itself was cool, at least Mark's perspective, I found the trail to be rather disappointing. It just went on and on. There was no alternate paths, and there was hardly any challenging terrain. For Colorado, this whole area was so flat, it was hardly a hike at all. The trail was just long, very long. It took us until noon to reach the end. There was no one else on it. I know that it was a hard trail to find, and many of the other locals might share my sentiments, but we were there all day and we didn't run into anyone. Of course, it wasn't until we reached the end that things started to get really weird. The trail didn't loop at all, and I inwardly groaned knowing that we would have to walk these same 3 boring hours back. We took our time eating our lunch. As we did, I swear I could hear noises for the first time. There were animals moving through the forest nearby. We could hear the rustling of the brush. I looked and saw through the foliage the vague outline of a single buck's head moving past us. It was odd, but I dismissed it. We packed up what was left of our lunches and started the trek back. Every once in a while, I would hear the rustling again. I'd look into the trees and oftentimes I would see the buck's head. Eventually though, I noticed it was making far too much noise, and it was doing so far too frequently. Mark told me to slow down and stop, and being Mark, he cracked a joke about it. But finally, he went silent, and we both still heard the rustling. Now even Mark was a little freaked out. He turned around and saw the vaguest outline of the buck's head again. This time, to me, there seemed to be something wrong. The head was far too high up, around the higher branches of the trees. I noticed it. Mark didn't. I should have said something, but I didn't have time. Just as I was there, it was gone again, going off further into the forest. I remember Mark talking about how the deer was annoying as hell, about how he was going to scare it off or something. I don't remember exactly what he said, and that bothers me, because I should remember. He was one of my best friends. I do remember him yelling at it, and at the time it was funny. "Hey Buck, yeah, you, leave us alone." He walked off the road and disappeared down the ridge, behind a layer of trees, pursuing it. For a minute there was silence. That minute became 2. "Mark?" I called out. No answer. 5 minutes passed. I climbed down the ridge after him. "Mark!" I followed the general direction he had gone in, keeping the way back to the road in my mind. I wouldn't go far. I knew, because he was smart enough to not go far. He hadn't. After a short time, I found a place where there was no signs of struggle. In addition, there was blood. There was a lot of blood. It was all over the trees and all over the ground. I cursed to myself. There were other things too, in addition to the blood. Pieces of flesh that I didn't like to look at. There were marks showing that something had been dragged away from here. "Mark!" I called out, ferociously now. Forgetting the trail for a second, I ran forward, along the drag marks. After running too far to be safe, I reached a small ravine, with a creek running through it. I narrowly stopped myself. It wasn't a long drop, but it would hurt you, and a sprained ankle in the middle of the forest was bad news. The trail stopped here. "Mark," I murmured, then called out again, "Mark!" I heard something, but it wasn't Mark. Across the ravine from me, I heard rustling and saw the trees stirring. Something stepped through the brush and revealed itself. It was the second image burned into my mind. Please give me a second. I've spent every single day for the past few months trying to tell myself it wasn't real. At first, I saw a head of a buck, but it came forward and I realized that it was at least 7 feet above the ground. I was staring at a 7-foot creature straight in the face that had a massive buck's head, but a humanoid body. The creature snorted. Its buck face remained neutral, scared looking even, as if it wasn't sure of the malicious whims of the body beneath it. There was blood dripping from its horns, which were not like the horns of an average buck, but jagged, pointed, and unorganized. A mess of sharp points. Its human body was dark-skinned and naked. I remember both of its arms and legs. They started human, but near the bottom they distorted and became animalistic. At the end of its legs were powerful hooves. At the end of its arms were hands and very long claws, every bit as jagged as the horns on its head. In one of those claws was Mark's body being held by his shirt. I examined him only briefly, just long enough to notice that the shape of his head was not what it had once been. For a moment there was silence. I didn't scream. I couldn't believe what was in front of me. Then the creature's ears ruffled. It dropped Mark and started backing up. Its deer head hung lazily to the side as it moved. My brain rang, suddenly. It's going to jump the gap. It's coming for me. With the logical side of my mind shut off, I turned around and ran, hopefully in the exact opposite direction the way I came. Behind me, I heard a powerful grunt, and then a scuffle of the monster landing on the bank. There was a horrifying roar. Something that sounded like a grizzly bear and a buck shouting together. I had never run so fast or so desperately in all of my life, but it was gaining on me, and as I ran through the forest, I started to feel its warm, hungry breath on my back. Its hands were extending, and I swear I could feel its claws scratch me. I ran and scurried up the bank leading to the path. I don't know how I got there without it grabbing me, but I did. Then I took off down the road, hoping I was going the right direction. While running, I threw off my backpack and gained some speed. I think the bank delayed it, slightly. That's the only reason I can account as to how I got in front of it. Somehow, I ran and ran and ran. I didn't stop. Eventually, I didn't hear it anymore. But I didn't care. I kept running. I have never been a long-distance runner, but my adrenaline was not going to wear off anytime soon. I intended to take advantage of it. When I reached the end of the trail and saw the road again, I couldn't believe it. I got into my car. Just before I took off, I shot a glance back up the trail, at the point where it went up between the 2 mountains, and was visible from the road. I would regret it. Standing there at the beginning of the trail was the Skinwalker, as I've come to call it. It had given up its chase, but stood there, watching me hungrily, waiting to see if I would come back. Its deer head hung lazily dead to one side. The blood on its body was beginning to dry. It had run the whole trail and didn't look tired at all. I twisted the ignition and floored the car and never came back. They never found Mark, and I would never explain what happened. No one would believe me. I thought I needed to tell someone, which is why I'm posting it here. It came back to me in my dreams, nightmares. That creature, the Skinwalker. Somehow, I doubt that forest was really sacred. In fact, I'm sure it was the opposite. Because the image that flashes through my mind most often is not the horrific creature. It isn't Mark's corpse. It's that circle, which must have been maintained over the years by those who knew, those who understood. That old circle, left alone for so long. I'm not being followed by anything other than my memories of that moment. That moment that felt like an eternity to me was clearly only a few seconds, but they were the most haunting seconds of my life. For a bit of context, I'm a Canadian university student currently living in central Quebec. Not like Montreal or anything, but a very small town bordering a very small city in the middle of nowhere. The landscapes are sort of an emerald dream, with titanic mountains jutting out aggressively, all of which blanketed in a dense forest. I love my town. Everything's within walking distance. Friends, the bar, the lake. It's all great and nearby. So we often hit the town together. No need to drive anywhere or anything. Last night, we decided to have a little bonfire on this little ridge off the side of the lake, which doesn't really provide too much surface area for a bonfire. For this reason, the 10 of us were huddled around a dimly lit campfire instead. Guitar is being played, fine alcohol is being drank, and good times are being had by all. As the night draws on, I've charged myself with keeping the bulk of the fire going. Nobody else is too apt at any sort of camping, or otherwise outdoorsy activities in my group. Up to this point, all was very normal, other than my close friends acting a little off. After our first few, he had ran out and left by himself to go get more. The ridge was out of sight of the road due to the dense forest paths that we used to get to and from it, so he goes and cuts through it alone. When he gets back, he's acting like he had 100 beers. Looked like he wasn't used to his legs. Strangely enough, he had a full case of beer with him, so I assumed he hadn't drank any more. He also wasn't gone for very long at all. Honestly, we drank together often, me and him. I know what he's like drunk, and this was especially unusual. So he's trying to talk to the people, but he just can't say real words. It's as if he was trying to perform all of the accents of normal English speech, but didn't actually understand the words or syntax. Kind of like one of those videos that are meant to show what English might sound like to non-English speakers. As I mentioned before, the fire wasn't providing much in terms of light. So when we'd head off to go grab some firewood, I'd usually jerry-rig my cell phone flashlight to my belt to keep the area in front of me well lit. We do this a few times and some of the others begin to lose motivation to collect wood, so I take matters into my own hands for the last run of the evening. This brush was completely uncultivated, super thick, very dark. The only discernible paths that were about shoulder width were obstructed by an oddly fallen tree here and there. So I'm yanking at trees, trying to feel for anything dry. Even my phone light was falling behind waist-level foliage. I didn't really have too much lighting. Once I got a handful or so, I figured it'd be good enough for the last burn, so I get the idea to head back. But just as I get this thought, my phone falls straight onto the ground. So of course, it had to land face down, blocking the flash, preventing me from finding the right way. Regardless, I didn't look forward immediately. For some reason, I decided to let the darkness sink in. I had never been in such a dark environment that I was unable to see my hand in front of my face. Even the brightest moonbeams couldn't breach the canopy above. However, as I focus on my surroundings, I quickly realized I was referencing my frame using a subtle glow. It was yellowish but twisted into a green color the more I concentrated. I was immediately very startled by its lack of movement, yet curious. I hesitantly paced inward, carelessly leaving my phone on the ground. The glow split distinctly into two yellow-green bulbs that were locked onto each other. They're my eyes. My vision is really bad, especially with lighting, so from a distance my eyes will merge the source of light together. For instance, I can't see stars. This caused my curiosity to go nuts. What kind of fat raccoon is trying to stalk me through these bushes? Something was hitting me though. I was terrified. I bore a fear so intense that my stomach began to churn. My curiosity has always outweighed my fears, and this situation was no different. I began to know what it was. It began to know me. There was this very strange bond in that moment that chilled me to the core. I felt a connection to this living thing, but its eyes were pumping fear into my body. The worst mistake I'd ever make is to follow. Nervously, I yelled loud enough to attempt to startle whatever it may have been in this chilling stare down against me at only about a 7 or 8 foot distance. Its absolutely motionless reaction to my help began to chip away at my sanity. Was I staring at 2 elaborately placed lights in the middle of the woods? No, it couldn't be. They had eyes, and this battle cry didn't even make him flinch. Because of that, part of me rationalized that it could not possibly be any animal. It's probably some kind of prank, or a marker for some type of ecology job. So I pressed towards it again, walking as if I knew for sure that this was all to be logically explained. As I closed the gap, my vision began to home in on these lights. Plainly defined ovals, resplendent with the brightest darkness I'd ever felt. When they were legitimately just out of my range of clear vision, the lights, which were waist level before, rose up. They rose as eyes would on a bear standing onto its hind legs, instantly reducing me to a quivering mess. Odd thing is, bears don't have antlers. I haven't ever heard of a moose with piercing eyes that can stand on its hind legs either. As soon as it began straightening up, I was already getting out of there. I just ran. Luckily, I managed to kick my phone out of the dirt and quickly picked it up. The flashlight was still going, making it really easy to spot once I kicked it. Rolling through the woods, illuminating phone now in my hand, I made it back to my campfire completely out of breath. Now, normally I'd spray this story all over my friends, but I knew they'd just think I'd went crazy or hit my head collecting wood. Also, considering I didn't have a bundle of sticks anymore, my shortness of breath was probably a little unjustified. I sat down and noticed that my friend from before was still being very strange, but it seemed like with every passing minute he was adapting more to the conversation and was steadily attempting to contribute more and more. We're all good friends, which is why I find this unusual, considering the fact that he legitimately could not speak English 1 minute, and then within 15 he's practically back to normal. Still, something was off. He was the last to leave the campfire, even after the other guys had pissed it out, and he just stayed there staring at the ashes. After most of us had gotten home, he calls me. An entire minute of silence. The whole time I'm shouting at him to tell me where he is, and that if he's too drunk to get home, I'll go and find him. Disturbingly, he just hangs up. After a cigarette and another half a beer, he calls me back again. This time he's trying to talk like before, but he can't pronounce any words again. He never did touch that case of beer he brought, by the way. Just sat next to him during the whole fire. So I tell him to stop being an idiot and to tell me where he is. He hangs up again, leaving me to figure that he's just drunk, emotional, and that maybe I was just being a little too harsh on him. Honestly though, I was just so shaken up and I needed to confide to somebody about what I had just seen, but he was incapacitated and it frustrated me. After that, I went to bed and I figured he was just being strangely drunk. It was insanely weird to me, but I had a few drinks too and I wasn't really having any of his crap and I figured I'd try to get some sleep. When I wake up in the morning, I have a text from his roommate asking me why he saw him crawl from underneath his car in the driveway this morning. We haven't seen him since, and his roommate said he thought he'd never made it home because he didn't come in. So, what's wrong with my friend? I'm hoping he comes back because if he doesn't, my buddy just got his skin and carjacked by a flesh gate or something. So now I'm scared. Sorry for the long post, I just needed to vent and tell the story properly as I remember it. Update. He came back home around 8:30 p.m. last night looking a little shaken up, but otherwise normal. He seems fine for now. This happened last night, so for the past 2 days, I've been reading a lot about skinwalkers. I've scourged the top posts of all time and read every single story from there, and also the local news for skinwalker stories. I live in NWT. It's the province about Alberta, about 200,000 in population, beautiful in the summer. We're surrounded by the woods and lots of lakes. There's one particular trail people often drive to access said lakes. Anyway, last night I was driving on the trail with a guy friend to find a secluded spot. He recommended V Lake, which was the first lake you access on the trail system. The way it's set up, there's a long narrow dirt road at the right of the highway that you have to drive for at least 20 minutes before you get to the lake itself. The dirt road is surrounded by trees and is riddled with little lakes here and there. It's my favorite lake to drive to. mostly because I love the narrow dirt roads with lots of tall trees. So it's Sunday night and we're the only ones driving. We weren't high or drunk, we were just having fun, listening to music. Then as I was driving, about 10 minutes into the dirt road, an extremely strong smell of rotten flesh filled our noses. This weirded my friend out and made me panic. The first thing that came to my mind was skinwalkers. It was vile and the smell just hit us all of a sudden. The windows were closed and the AC was set to the lowest. The car is clean and nothing there could have caused it. I asked him what he thought of the smell. He said barbecue. I told him there's a current fire ban in effect in the city. That can't be. He agreed and he said it smelled really rotten to him. The smell was strong. It was making me nauseous. I'm now more aware of the woods surrounding us. How it actually makes me feel kind of claustrophobic. How every turn and curve makes me more and more anxious. My gut was telling me something isn't right, and I kept thinking skinwalkers and the stories I've read up for the past 2 days. I was getting more scared by the moment. Then we drove through another curve and my lights and high beams shone quickly on a person standing inside the mouth of the woods, and that's when I panicked. I asked my friend, "Do you still want to drive down this road?" "Yeah, I don't care," he replied. During this time, I seriously knew something wasn't right and my brain kept screaming at me to turn around. I kept glancing at my mirrors. Frank Ocean's voice wasn't calming me down. I was so scared. I think he saw my discomfort, so he piped up again. "We can turn around if you want." I slammed on my brakes and did a 4-point turn and hightailed it out of there. Once we were back on the highway of the trail, I told him about what I thought of the smell, but not the person I saw in the woods. I didn't want to freak him out. We had a long conversation about it. I knew we shouldn't have, but he kept asking questions because he was curious, so I answered, but tried not to mention its name. Also, while we were there, we were parked at the picnic ground of a lake, and little stones started hitting the driver's side of the truck. A couple would hit every minute or so. It unnerved the crap out of me, but I ignored it. There was no one else in the trail because we didn't hear or see anyone driving. That was kind of weird too. One statement of his that kind of unnerved me was, I think it was trying to lure us further into the woods. So on the way back, I had him drive so I could calm down. I was calmer on the drive back. There were some foxes with glowing eyes in the middle of the road that kind of freaked me out at first, but then I realized they're just foxes. Also saw roadkill by the immediate side of the road that wasn't there before, which was pretty weird. It was about the size of a beaver, but really nothing to panic about, I think. So yeah, this all happened from 1 to 3 a.m. last night. I now really believe in skinwalkers. Just wasn't expecting on encountering one. My uncle, aunt, and all my cousins live in Utah, like 2 states over from me, California. They drive around a lot, especially for family reunions. My uncle often tells all the kids and everyone else a story when we go camping, mostly since someone usually wants to hear it again. He was driving back home alone one night in the summer. He knew the area well and he wasn't worried, but he was still kind of creeped out from, well, driving alone at night. He was in a long road of that sort of sparse, deserty area with the hills and bushes. My uncle then heard a weird noise, like a chirp or something. The way he described it was the first part of the he that Michael Jackson makes, without the second he. It sounds very ridiculous, I know, but unsettling in the cold, dark outdoors. And it seemed clear enough to not have just been creaking metal, or something like that. Obviously, he got a little weirded out by it. He's a lively, tough dude with the company of others, but he hates being alone. My uncle heard it from somewhat far away, but then he started hearing it again, and it was almost ramping up, getting faster. It was also getting slightly louder. He sped up, but it still continued to get closer. He looked to the left outside his window and saw something running almost parallel to his truck, pretty far off the road but inside the bush area, upright like a tall, skinny human. He said it was brown and furry, and it just bothered him. It wasn't horror movie monster scary, but it was something's wrong scary. He heard the moving of leaves. The noise was now basically constant. It sounded different, like a person sounds when they're tired and speak every syllable in one breath of air. The animal thing sort of faded into the plants. The thing was, though, he didn't feel any less scared, since now he feared it was in front of him. and that he would see it clearly on the road, but nothing happened for the rest of the ride. He usually clears out the night with his story. Camping stories are fun, but they're sort of harmless. This one gets everyone creeped out and thinking, something that wouldn't have gone away if he told the story earlier. For a little background on my story, I live in a small town outside of Kansas City, Kansas. But the area I live in has lots of history around it, and there was a lot of Native American activity in the area. My house has a long driveway and is in the middle of a stand of woods. The woods have been there as long as there's records of the area. When we first moved into our home, everything seemed pretty normal, but after living there a month, that's when abnormal stuff started to happen. Pounding on the roof, animal scratches on our vehicles, and we started finding a lot of dead animals on the property. We even contacted Kansas State game wardens, but couldn't find any evidence of poaching or poisoning, or even the animals getting hit by cars. So after about 2 years of this, my older brother moves back in and brings his dog with him. One night at about 11 p.m. the dog starts whining to be let out, so I put him on the leash and let him walk around the yard. Suddenly, he starts trying to yank me back towards the house. This uneasy feeling washes over me and I notice something that smells like rotting catfish guts. I feel like someone was watching me, so I turn around, and down by our garage, just inside the light, I see this figure. It was about 5 feet tall, hunched over, and it was very pale. It had small, deep, beady eyes and had a deer-like face. A sense of pure terror washed over me. I've never been more scared of anything in my life, and to this day, I've never felt that level of fear. I ran back into the house to wake up my dad and brother. They grab some shotguns and run outside to check it out. All they find are some pretty deep scratch marks on the garage. We contacted the game wardens the next day. I described what I saw and smelled, and they said it was probably a very sick deer that had contracted some sort of illness or something of that sort. Weird stuff kept happening for another 2 or 3 years. Then we had a really bad drought and stuff stopped occurring. So I don't know what the hell I saw that night. I was wondering if anyone had seen or smelled anything similar to that. When I was 12 years old, my 15-year-old brother and I experienced a very horrific event while at our grandparents' cabin. My grandparents own a cabin on a rather large island in southern Sweden, which contains only 2 cabins, separated by slightly less than a mile. One summer, my brother and I, along with my mother and sister, went to visit them for a weekend. The thing we did most during our days there was go fishing. On the first day of our stay, we were planning to fish. We set everything up. All we had to do now was go dig for worms, which we used for bait. Grabbing a shovel along with a bucket, we went back up to the cabin and down a short slope and through a trail where we usually find plenty of worms. The forest is very dense and barely any light shines through, which makes the whole setting a bit unnerving for me, as I have always been easily frightened. I hear something walking and I look at my brother with a very scared face. He brushes it off as if there was nothing to be afraid of, and insists that we go check it out. We walk a bit further down the trail, which I know leads to an open meadow, as I have been there looking for mushrooms with my mom at a previous occasion. Before we get to the open, my brother holds up his hands as to indicate for me to stop. I looked over his shoulder and see behind the trees what appears to be a moose looking directly at us. I got relieved as I knew they were friendly, and as I had seen plenty of moose nearby. My brother, however, who has never been scared of anything, looks back at me with the biggest eyes I've ever seen, and the most pale I've ever seen someone, as he tells me we should get out of here. Without questioning him, I start to walk back while he keeps pushing me as to make me move quicker, and as we reach the cabin, we are pretty much running. My mom and grandma were sitting at the porch as we got into the front, and I tell them that we saw a moose. My brother, on the other hand, remains completely silent. Safe to say that there was no fishing that day. The following day, we didn't even bring up fishing. I'm sitting on the porch reading a magazine, and my brother is sitting inside on the couch doing the same, although he still has the scared look in his eyes. I spend the following hour or two reading several magazines until my grandpa asks me where the shovel is. I realize that we left it where we were looking for worms the previous day, and I tell him where it is. Just as he was about to go and get it, my mother tells me that my brother and I have to go get it, since we left it there. She also tells me that we should go dig up some worms, as she wants to go fishing later with us. I don't question it, but my brother seems unnerved by it. This made everything all the more unsettling for me, as my brother is not easily scared at all, pretty much the opposite of me. We put on our shoes and head to the back of the cabin and walk down the trail heading to where the shovel and bucket is. Once we are about 10 feet from where the shovel is, my brother stops and tells me I should go and dig, as he did it the last time. I do as he says and I start digging for worms. I have this very strong feeling that he stayed back because he was scared something would happen. I start hearing the bushes around me sway, and I hear sneaky footsteps moving closer and closer. Everything is all the more creepy as I have no idea where the footsteps are coming from. 1 second I'm sure they're coming from my right, the next it feels like they're coming from a completely opposite direction. I quickly put a few worms that I found in the bucket, and as I fumble to pick up the shovel, I feel as I'm being watched. My brother walks up to me and helps me seal the bucket, and I tell him it feels like someone is watching, to which he responds that we should leave. Just as we turn around and are ready to head back, I hear a crack from behind me and turn around. I look down the trail and see the moose once again, peeking at me from behind a tree. It looked very different from what they usually look like, as it felt much slimmer and sort of twisted. At the time, I'm more confused and curious than I am scared, and my brother is dead silent. I can't quite see the whole body of it, but I know that something is wrong. I stand for a couple more seconds watching it, as it is staring right at us. From what I can see, I realize that it's not standing on its 4 legs. It is leaned forward, as an old man with really bad posture, with its arms hanging straight down. I also had a weird sensation that the creature was trying to talk to me, saying, "Let me help you." In a few seconds, I get struck with panic and start walking really fast back to the cabin, my brother doing the same. It only takes a second before we are both in a full sprint running back to the cabin. I turn around and the moose-like creature is nowhere to be seen. We put the shovel by the shed where we took it and bring the bucket of worms to the front where my mom and grandparents are. The day goes on as if nothing had happened, and we don't speak of it at all. Since this happened, I never thought I'd bring it up with my brother. We both just sort of knew that it would feel wrong to speak about it, and none of us had visited my grandparents' cabin since. To this day, I'm not sure at all what I saw. I mentioned it to my friend once, and he told me if what I said was true, then it was probably a Wendigo or a skinwalker. He showed me some pictures from Google, and I instantly found resemblances of the creature that I saw back then. Until recently, I had completely repressed this event. But after reading several stories about Wendigo and skinwalkers, my mind has once again become haunted by this event. And in a terrible way, I realized that what I most likely saw was something far more horrific than a moose. Out of all the things I've read about Wendigo, the most terrifying thing is that people say never to talk to it. I'm just imagining in my head what could have happened if I tried talking back to the creature when I felt it was speaking to me. Part 2. Alright, so some people asked me to share more regarding the events that happened when I was visiting my grandparents' cabin. I have not been there since, but my grandmother and her new husband stay there every summer. Note that this is about 6 years ago since the moose incident. Through the magic of Facebook, I contacted my grandma. We don't know each other all too well anymore, so I don't really feel comfortable calling her. I told her about the moose-like creature and how my brother and I both saw it. She proceeded by typing for nearly 15 minutes, and I waited patiently. Her reply was a full story of her own encounter with what she said she had hoped to be just a dysfunctional moose. Her writing was in Swedish, so I will do my best to translate it. About 20 years ago, I was staying in the cabin by myself. Your grandpa was working at the time, so I was alone for the whole week. One night while I was sleeping, I woke up with an uneasy feeling. I wasn't sure why, but I just knew something was wrong. I felt as if I was being watched. My first thought was to fall back asleep, and so I did. I woke up in what I believe was about an hour, and this time I was sure something wasn't as it should be. I felt the same feeling of being watched, and I could clearly hear something moving outside. I grab my bedside candle and light it. As I get out of bed, I choose to not pull the curtains as I have a terrifying feeling that someone will be staring right at me. By now, I am convinced that something is trying to rob me. I was sleeping in the room at the back of the cabin, and so I walked up to the front and looked out by the porch, but see nothing. There are no neighbors nearby, and I can't call the police as I don't have a phone. I decide to go back to bed and try to sleep the fear away. I lay there for at least an hour without falling asleep, and although the sound is gone, the unpleasant feeling has stuck around. At the backside of the cabin, right outside my window, was an older cabin, which was used before this one was built. The place was creepy, and we eventually decided to burn it down some years later. Anyways, I hear something bumping around side of it, and I realize that I'm gonna have to look out the window. I get out of bed, light the candle again, and pull the curtains. The uneasy feeling is still there, and I have the strongest feeling that something is going to stare right back at me. I pull the curtains, and for a complete second I am caught in complete terror. I see something staring right back at me, but it's no robber. It's not a person. It's a moose. I expected to be relieved to find that it was nothing but a harmless animal, but that is far from what I was. After a few seconds, I calmed down, and the panic faded a bit. The thing was still staring at me, but it was sure not a normal moose. I took a few seconds to investigate it. For a first, it was not standing on 4 legs. It was bent forward, as if in the upper front legs were just barely floating above the ground. It was also much slimmer than moose usually are, and it had this sort of disturbing twist in the body. The antlers looked flat out terrifying. Naturally, it doesn't say anything, but I had this strong feeling that it wanted me to come out. It wanted me to let it help me. Although I felt that's what it wanted me to hear, I just knew the thing had bad intentions. I faint within a few seconds, and I wake up in the morning and let out a scream of panic. The creature is gone, and I am contemplating whether or not I was dreaming. To this day, I was unsure if this actually happened, or if I was just dreaming. Now that I know you saw the same thing, I know it was real. My grandma suggested that I tell my brother that I spoke to her about it, and I am seriously considering doing so. I mean, this for sure confirms that what we saw was not a normal moose. I had some thoughts thinking it might have just been a handicapped or dysfunctional moose. But by the way my grandma said it tried to communicate with her and convince her, I knew it was the same thing that my brother and I encountered, as it too tried to talk to us. Apparently, she had already told this story to my mom and grandpa, but they just brushed it off and said it was either an injured moose or she was dreaming. Hearing about this story just made me all the more scared, but at the same time curious about what the creature actually was, and what was its purpose. Was he trying to lure us into the forest? Was he actually trying to help us with something? Hopefully I get some more clarification the more I talk to people about it. I ended up sending some pictures of Wendigo and Skinwalkers to her, and she definitely saw resemblances between them. That all sent shivers down my spine. To all of the people reading this, if you ever encounter a weird-looking creature with antlers, do not speak with it, or even acknowledge their presence. That's what they want. So this is a story about an experience I had late last year. I was in Dorset, UK, the night before Christmas Eve. Opinions are welcome as I can't really explain it, and everyone I tell the story to thinks I'm just crazy or I'm making it up. What makes me think this may not be a skinwalker is that I've always heard that they won't enter a person's home unless you specifically invite them in, unless it took the open window as an invitation. In addition, I have nothing which to explain the orb and flashes unless I'm really losing my mind. Either way, I don't claim to have any literary ability. I also didn't know anything about skinwalkers until I tried to figure out what this thing was. I'll just tell it like I experienced it. I was staying with my parents for a while in my old bedroom. We had picked up the house cheaply just 3 years prior, when its former elderly owner suddenly passed away in one of the bedrooms. A friend and I had been hanging out for a week or so, enjoying the holiday playing video games, going for short walks with my sister's dog on the nearby beach surrounding the fields. On the 22nd of December, this friend left to go spend Christmas with his own family, and not knowing what to do with my newfound bedroom for the evening, I decided to go to sleep early, around 9 p.m. for a change. My bedroom is on the second floor, and my window was left open a few inches to let in a cool breeze. My sleep was restless. I kept waking and re-entering sleep every half hour until around midnight, when I finally drift off for good, or so I thought. Now, I don't often have dreams, and if I do, I don't remember much of them, but the dream that I had this night was stranger than the others, and it is relevant to the rest of the story. I was seeing through the eyes of another person as they emerged from a bush in one of my neighbor's gardens. They were steadily and silently approaching my own garden, climbing over a 6-foot wooden fence as easily as you or I climb a set of stairs. I couldn't see any hands or feet. It was as if it was a Steadicam just gliding over the ground. My sister's dog was asleep on the tiny patch of grass near the tree, and I came to a stop directly beneath my open window. The viewpoint then switched to resting on a branch near the top of the tree in my garden, watching the back of a pale white humanoid figure silently glide up the side of my house and looking at me through my open window. This is where I woke up, covered in a cold sweat, and decided that I should just lay there for a while with my eyes closed. All I could hear was the wind in the trees outside, as I thought about the dream, hoping to remember some more of it. Without warning, the silence was broken by my sister's dog barking like crazy. About 10 seconds later, it turned to yelping before fading into silence once more. Thinking it was squirrels or something else spooking the dog, I planned to go back to sleep, but then I started to hear slow scratching sounds on the wooden paneling on the outside of the house. It only covers the second floor, so I reasoned that it couldn't have been my sister's dog. So I sat up, intending to take a look outside, pausing momentarily to glance sideways at the radio clock illuminating the room with its yellow-orange glow, and of course, it's 3:33 a.m. exactly. This is when the unexplainable intense fear washes over me, stronger than I have ever felt before or since. It definitely felt like something was in the room with me, like I was somehow intruding or being watched. I thought I could hear a low murmuring coming from all around me. I saw something move across the ceiling and come to rest behind the room's main light shade. I closed my eyes and laid down again for reasons I can't explain even now, as if I was being willed by an outside force. Then, with my eyes still closed, a floating white orb appeared roughly where I had seen the shadow on the ceiling, accompanied by the sound of 1,000 lighters being sparked at once. It was almost deafening. There was a bright white flash that filled the room with light that I could clearly see with my eyes still closed. As the flash subsided, I was left in total darkness again. I immediately sat upright, wondering what just happened. Slowly, I reached for the bedside light with my right arm, and it wouldn't turn on. Memories of unplugging it so my friend could recharge his laptop at some point earlier in the week came flooding back to me. It was only then when I was made fully aware of the dark humanoid figure now standing completely motionless in the center of my room, beneath the main light, as it unnaturally snapped its head to the left to watch my arm reaching for the light. It slowly turned its head back onto me, and I couldn't make out any facial features. It was as if its skin absorbed all light like a black hole. I stayed there for a good 2 minutes, just paralyzed in fear, not really comprehending what it was I was looking at. Then it abruptly, in a very jerking, unnatural movements, took a single step towards me and extended its open hand, ending in long, almost talon-like fingers. As it came even closer, I felt fear increase proportionally to its distance from me. It was almost touching my face when fight-or-flight mode engaged. Without even thinking, I jumped out of bed and slammed on the wall to turn on the main light switch. My head flicked back to cast a fresh eye on the thing, where inside of a fraction of a second, it crossed the room and threw itself out the open window, clearing the garden in a single jump before disappearing into the night at an impossible speed. I went downstairs to check on the rest of the house, and to make sure my parents were okay. Into the garden, I found my sister's dog whining softly, and attempting to hide behind the tree, shaking. I can't stop thinking back to that experience and wondering what would have happened if I stayed put, or even taken its hand. I've always been a bit of a skeptic, ever since I was a kid. Scary stories don't faze me, creepy games never frighten me, and whenever I hear something weird at night, I instantly assume it's something normal, an animal, or just the house settling. Despite this, something very unsettling happened to me the other day, and I'm not really sure what to make of it. I think it's the first time in years I've been genuinely frightened. I live in a forest area in the US. Me and my girlfriend live in a large cabin, and although there are no roads nearby, our nearest neighbors are at least a mile away. We also have 2 cats, one of which sleeps in the bedroom with us, while the other often goes out at night and does whatever cats do when they're out of sight. Anyway, I like to stay up late at night and sleep late into the morning, whereas my girlfriend's an early bird. It was 1 in the morning and I was watching a crappy TV in the living room while my girlfriend slept in the bedroom. I was beginning to grow tired when I heard something outside, near the cat door. For clarity, our cat door uses an electronic chip, so only our cats can use it. I assumed it was just one of the cats coming in or leaving the house, and I just ignored it. Then I heard it again. It sounded like something thudding against the cat door. It happened several times at random intervals, until I lost my patience and decided to go open the door. Clearly, the cat was having trouble getting in. I never thought about it at the time, but it was weird because we feed our cats well, and they're very lean rather than chubby. I passed the bedroom and peered in as I walked past, to see if my girlfriend heard the noises. She was fast asleep, but the cat that sleeps with us was staring at the window. I call her name. Nothing. She keeps staring. I shrugged it off and kept heading towards the kitchen. The back doors are through there, by the way. Anyway, so I reached the back door and saw a dark shape through the translucent door. I sighed, expecting the cat to be out there, and opened the door. It took me a moment to open the door, and I saw the cat tense up as I opened it. The door opened fully. I froze. It wasn't my cat. Whatever it was had started moving before I opened it up. I only caught a glimpse of a distorted figure, kind of like a tailless dog, bolting, and I mean absolutely pelting it. I freaked out and slammed the door shut. What the hell was it? I wasn't sure. My natural skepticism kicked in, and I assumed it was just my other cat, and I had merely startled it. Perhaps the darkness made it appear larger. Nevertheless, I was creeped out, and I decided to go to sleep. As I slipped into bed, I realized something horrifying. The second cat was asleep on the rug. It took a while to get to sleep that night. Everything seemed normal until a few hours later. I awoke to a strange feeling of dread. Something wasn't right. My girlfriend was fast asleep. I held my breath and heard something creaking by the door. It sounded too loud to be one of the cats. It was as if a person was walking about. I reached toward my bedside cabinet and flicked on the lamp. The room was illuminated and I saw something just standing outside the door, staring at me. The same twisted figure I had spotted earlier outside. It wasn't very tall, maybe a little over 5 feet, but it was its face that scared me the most. I only caught a glimpse of it, but what I saw will stay with me forever. It looked like a dog, but with an elongated face and almost human-like eyes. You know that weird, distorted snarl dogs pull when they're pissed off? It had that expression. I instantly started yelling profanities as I scrabbled backwards, trying to straighten up. The creature turned and sprinted down the hall. I heard it dash outside and go past the window behind us, just above the headboard. I managed to look out as my girlfriend started to panic as she woke up fully. We both caught a glimpse of whatever the hell that thing was as it dashed off into the woods near our home. Grabbing my trusty shotgun from underneath the bed, as well as a couple rounds from the ammunition box that sits next to it, I ran out of the room in my underwear and rounded into the kitchen. The door was open. I'd forgotten to lock it when I saw the thing originally. I haven't seen it since, but we still live in our cabin. But I've bought sturdy locks for all the main doors and windows in the house, and always check the exit points at night. I also go to bed a bit earlier than I used to, so I'm asleep when the freaks of the night start to wake up. I've read a bunch of forums, and the only thing that I can compare it to, based on what I saw, is a skinwalker. If you know anything about these things, please let me know. As I am writing you this, other skinwalkers are in front of my house. They are surrounding me. If I die, I want you to know what happened. I stand alone, nobody to help me. I hear them howling. By my estimation, there are at least 5 of them. But let's tell the story from the beginning, shall we? My childhood was nice. It was going smooth and buttery until my 8th birthday. After a long day and a party with my friends, summer heat slowly disappeared as the night came on. I was out in the backyard playing with my Spider-Man figure. I was feeling safe and happy, until my dog shot across the yard and ran off into the forest. I should probably describe the dog. He was a big Siberian Husky, white. His name was Johnny. Anyways, back to the story. The dog shocked me. Then in a second, I went from feeling safe to feeling like I could die at any moment. Right then, fog rolled into my backyard. I could see the outline of a figure standing in it. Then, a wolf howled. It sounded like a wolf at first, but it sounded wrong. I screamed for my dad, who came out running. I told him about Johnny and the wolf howling. He then said, "Son, there's no wolves in this country." He ushered me inside and grabbed his shotgun and went searching for Johnny. He came back empty-handed, but I knew something happened, that he saw something. I could see it in his eyes. That night, he stayed awake on the couch, gripping his shotgun until the sun came up. From that point on, every night the fog would roll in our backyard, and the figure would start howling. As I grew older, I could not be convinced by my father it was just a wolf. So, on one winter evening, he sat me down in the couch by the fireplace and told me a story. "Son, long before men ruled the earth, other creatures lived on it. So, naturally, when we came, they felt angry. They wanted to get rid of us. That thing you see every night howling is one of them. They are called skinwalkers. They are sort of shapeshifters. They can take the shape of a human or animal. Also, they take their memories, their voice, their life. But you can always recognize the skinwalker from the real deal. When they speak, there is something wrong in their voice, a certain amount of something sinister. My son, I have dealt with skinwalkers all my life. Looks like you'll have to do that too." He then gave me an unmarked red leather-bound book and told me to read it in its entirety. And so I began. In it was everything about skinwalkers. How do they live, and what they do, what do they feed on, and how to hunt them. My father then moved away to the city when I was 20. He knew then I could guard the front line. Fast forward a few days ago, I was in the backyard of the same house. Me, now a fully grown male, 25 years old, I was guarding, and an idea came to my mind. I'm gonna catch that skinwalker. So I prepared my traps, some signs, and put my lucky necklace on my neck. I poured holy water everywhere, in the sprinklers too, put salt in my shotgun gauges, also in my sniper rifle rounds. Night came, and by my expectations, at around 10 p.m. the fog came in. What was driving me to hunt this skinwalker was this. I can't have a family with this thing around us. Why, you may ask, because this skinwalker didn't do anything to me. Wrong. He got my dog. My dad found it in the creek a few days later after he was hunting. He took a good friend of mine. I didn't want my kids to live a life like me, to be scared constantly, to not have a teenage life just because this thing came every night and attacked my house. So when the fog came, I got ready on my roof and waited. After only 10 minutes of waiting, it was here. He started doing as usual, howling and throwing stuff at my house, mostly animal carcasses. And then, out of nowhere, I turned the sprinklers on. It screamed so hard it was shaking my house. Then I shot at it with my silver bullet with some salt. It came down, but I knew it wasn't dead. It was just unconscious. I then came down from the roof. I didn't turn off the sprinklers. I picked the thing up. It must have weighed around 300 pounds. But I was a huge dude, 6'8". I have trained for this my entire life. I was ready. I took it into my basement and strapped it into a chair, placed in a cage that had electricity running through its bars. I then waited for it to wake up. When it did, it started howling immediately. It changed from its wolf shape to one of my dead friends just to hurt me. I left it there to rot. But then, it started howling again. It called another. This brings me to this moment. It's still howling. They are surrounding me. I have ammo and food in my bunker. My house was built like a fortress, but the chance of survival is small. I will try to stop them, to save you. So if I die here, take my example. Be prepared for everything. Last night, I had an experience with what I believe to be a skinwalker. I was sleeping on my couch. I'm in the process of remodeling my bedroom. It had been storming on and off all night, but in that moment, the wind was only blowing. It was about 1 in the morning when I was woken up by a very strange noise. I can't describe it that well, but it sounded like an animal call, except as if a human was making the sound. It was a long, deep noise that kept on going, almost like a foghorn. It sounded like it was right outside my window, in my backyard. In case you're wondering, I live in a country near the Ozark Mountains, and directly on the Trail of Tears. I've lived out there, in the middle of the woods my whole life. I've heard and seen everything: bears, deer, cougars, raccoons, coyotes. But the sound that I heard that night wasn't like anything that I've ever heard. I'm not going to lie, it scared the absolute hell out of me. I immediately went to my bedroom. I have a window that looks into my backyard as well. I wanted to see whatever it was, but I didn't want to pull back my living room curtains to come face to face with it. I couldn't see anything through my bedroom window, so I turned around and started walking back to the living room. Then something hit my window. It wasn't strong enough to break it, it just sounded like someone hit the palm of their hand on the glass. At that point, I went back to sleep and ignored the sound. Looking back on it, I should have recorded it, and I tried when the noise came back the next night, but every time I took out my phone, it stopped. Today, I built up enough courage to go into my backyard and to investigate. There were loose limbs everywhere. I had a bonfire a few weeks ago. The remaining ashes had been dug through, not blown by the wind or damaged by the rain. No, it looked like something took their hands and dug a hole. I did some research, and I think it's a skinwalker. I'm no stranger to these things. I've heard lots of stories about them, and considering that I've seen several things walking through the woods through my lifetime, I'm starting to become really convinced. So this happened to me last September, and I'm writing about it now, only because I've read so many experiences people have had that I'm at a point where I'm more comfortable talking about what happened. My best friends live out by a country farmland in Michigan. The land is very old and probably traces back to the Native Americans. There is even a nearby road called Indian Trail. Well, it was around 1:30 a.m. and I was leaving their house. And to paint a visual of what their yard looks like, the driveway is in the shape of a U, and they have many cars parked except for this one part near the front of the house where there is a giant evergreen tree nobody ever parks in front of, and a light that hangs over to illuminate this area. Where my car was parked is the furthest to the left, and I have to walk across the entire yard and past the tree in order to get to my car. Well, as I left that night, I reached about the center of the yard and suddenly felt my heart rate was skyrocketing. This happened out of nowhere, and I started running to get to my car as fast as I could. As I got into my car, my front windows were foggy, and as I started the car, there was a small patch clearing up at the bottom of the windshield where I could see clearly. And that's when I saw the thing squatting by the evergreen tree and watching me. I have never had that feeling as though my body was burning at 300 degrees and my heart was in my throat throbbing. I looked through that small patch of my window, which was now growing larger, and the thing wasn't moving. It was still frozen in place and squatting. It was not human, and it was not animal either. My body went numb. All of this happened in a matter of 30 seconds, and I backed out of the driveway and drove down the dirt road to get home, probably driving 70 miles an hour. I immediately repressed what happened to that point, and I don't even remember how I got home. The next day comes around, and I go over to their house again, and I was sitting in my friend's room, and I told her that I saw something in her yard last night. And she freaked out at me because she said it could have been a robber or a dangerous person. And I told her no, it wasn't a person. I described it as the khaki man, because it looked like those saggy khaki tan pants, but only the entire body was that texture. The head was bald with ears folded into the scalp, and pitch black beady eyes, like round buttons. Well, her husband overheard me talking about this, and he entered the room halfway into the story and waited for me to finish, and told me that him, his dad and brother have all seen it at once, and they called it Gollum. like the creature from the Lord of the Rings. I didn't know what it was, and they showed me a figurine of it, and it had similar resemblance to it. None of them ever seen it more than once. I told them that I didn't want to know anything more about it, and I tried to erase that this ever happened because it literally flipped my entire perception of this world around. Anything is possible. And while I've had paranormal experiences growing up as a child, I wasn't too scared about things like that. But to come across a creature that is not something my brain could have ever comprehended at this point. I believe that all kinds of things are out there. But all this time has passed since and I'm still traumatized from it. I don't want to live in fear and I still visit my friends frequently. But ever since then, they always walk me out if I'm leaving late at night. After a couple months passed, I decided that I wanted to know what it was that I saw. And after diving deep into online forums of people's paranormal experiences, I came across a story mentioning the term skinwalker, which I never heard before, so I decided to look it up, and that's what sparked my interest on researching more. I have read tons of stories online about encounters others have had with skinwalkers, which led me to research more about Navajo Native American folklore, and the one who walks on all fours. A part of me thinks that it could have certainly been that, but another part of me is not so sure, because this thing almost looked alien, and not so much like a coyote. Although we often hear coyotes in this area late at night. I described what this looked like to my friend who lives at the house, and she illustrated a spot-on picture of it that I'll attach here. I would love to hear from any of you with possible insight related to the subject of skinwalkers, as well as if you've seen anything like this. I have had some nightmares from it, and have thought about possibly talking to a Native American shaman who owns a shop nearby. But I'm not sure how I could approach a topic like that because it's a topic they don't like to speak about, which is why I wanted to share it here first. I told this story to some friends tonight after not thinking about it for a while and remembered how odd and creepy it really is. The man who told me about this terrifying experience in the Colorado wilderness is one of those distinct relatives that everyone has. They're your third cousin, twice removed, or something to that effect. I'm not positive exactly how we're related, but he's an incredible guy. I'll call him Greg. Greg is a decorated green beret with a silver star to his name that he earned by capturing the leader of an Afghan sniper cell without incurring any casualties. Despite his status of a huge badass, and not as inconsiderable size, 6'3", 200 pounds, Greg is a teddy bear, just an extremely humble, kind person. I have a lot of experience in the outdoors and have lived in Colorado for most of my life, and Greg and I had an extended conversation about our adventures in the woods at my grandmother's house for Thanksgiving. We were sitting on the couch wearing tacky holiday sweaters when a conversation turned to hunting. Greg mentioned offhand that he used to be an avid hunter, but had an experience that turned him off to it. He doesn't even like guns anymore, something I found surprising coming from an accomplished soldier. I pushed him to tell me what happened, and though he seemed uncomfortable with the idea, he finally did. I'm going to switch to first person now and try to write exactly what Greg told me. It was late October, which means elk season is up in the Indian Peaks wilderness, and I went up there to bag a few elk and just relax for a few days by myself. I parked the truck near a trailhead about 8 miles from where I would end up setting up camp, and was looking forward to the nice weekend in the woods with some nice peace and quiet after packing all my gear and getting ready. The first morning, I was in my deer blind, about 20 feet up in a tree with a cup of coffee and my rifle. The sun had just come up an hour or so ago. About 50 yards from my tree, the tree line ended and opened up into a big meadow where a lot of elk tended to roll through, and I could sight my rifle pretty well through the trees and could see most of the big grassy area. Maybe a couple hours passed, which really isn't boring that deep in the woods. I just drank my coffee from my thermos and listened to the life around me, feeling the woods getting ready for winter. I couldn't believe my luck when I glanced over the meadow and saw a large group of elk had started grazing in the meadow. The silent animals plodded along, munching at the grass, oblivious to me watching. Among the group was one of the most beautiful elk I had ever seen. It was called a monarch, which means its antlers had